Caroline Smith stood in front of the door leading to the landlady's study. She couldn't stop looking at the spacious hall with high ceilings and sparkling chandeliers. In one hand, she held the palm of her 6-year-old son Kyle's hand, and in the other a massive burgundy-colored suitcase that could have been wheeled but had been prevented from doing so by a breakage. A little further away was a second suitcase, smaller than the first, but still quite heavy to carry. "Mom, what are we going to do here? And why did we even come here?" "We don't know anyone here," Kyle asked. His big, childishly naive eyes reflected excitement and curiosity. Kyle was wearing a plaid shirt and trousers. His shoes were a little too small for him, but not critical. It would be worth a change. Caroline adjusted the collar of his jacket and whispered, "I'm sorry, son, but it's necessary, really, Kyle." "Who needs it? Dad?" "Then let him move in here. Why should we?" Kyle persisted. Caroline shrugged, then knocked on the door. The sound echoed around the room, making the guard wince. The door was opened by an older woman in a dark green dress. Her stern, cold gaze swept over Caroline and Kyle appraisingly. "Are you coming in?" she said without much enthusiasm in her voice. Caroline and Kyle looked at each other and walked into a huge room with expensive furniture. "I'm Mrs. Amanda Wilson. I hope you've heard of me," said the lady of the house and sat down in a chair. Caroline nodded in embarrassment and immediately extended her hand to greet her. "I'm Caroline Smith, and this is my son Kyle." Mrs. Wilson shook her head and ran her palm over the arm of the chair. She regarded her guests rather unceremoniously, with a look that had a touch of hostess in it. "Well, Caroline," she said in her sonorous, well-pitched voice, "we've had a lot of applications for this position. But why should we choose you?" Caroline looked at the hostess in bewilderment. "How is it to choose? I just really need a place to live so I can support my son. Until my husband Sam can sort things out. I thought you all knew that already." Mrs. Wilson raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Oh, even so. So? Is there some special reason for that? But why did you move to another town with complete strangers?" Caroline was visibly embarrassed, then decided to be frank. "My husband. He asked me to leave so we wouldn't fall victim to his associates. You see, he owed a large sum of money. He can't pay it back. He said he had made arrangements with you," she said in a low, barely audible voice. Mrs. Wilson looked at the guest carefully. "Well, I sympathize with you and understand your unfortunate position. Tell me, will it not affect your future work?" Caroline looked at the older woman with surprise. "Work? But I thought we were just staying with you for a while. And if you need help, I'm always available. Believe me, I'm a diligent, hard worker. I'll work hard so I won't be a burden. After all, my son's well-being is the most important thing." Mrs. Wilson leaned back in her chair. "This is your son, Kyle. I'm not mistaken, am I?" Caroline nodded confusedly, still not sure what Mrs. Wilson was getting at. Why speak in riddles? Does he really want to embarrass her with his compromising questions? Sam's good too. He promised everything would be all right, and he couldn't even make a decent deal. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wilson continued her impromptu interrogation. "Tell me, will your son live with you in the servants' quarters?" Caroline was taken aback. A servant. Who do these guests think she is? What does this have to do with servants? Could it be a mistake? The maid's cottage would probably be no worse than the main house. It would be better, more peaceful. "Yes," Caroline said. "Kyle will live with me." Mrs. Wilson frowned. Caroline could tell at once that she didn't like the answer. "You see, here's the thing. The maid's cottage is quite spacious," said the woman, "but it can be cramped for 2 people. Consequently, it would be difficult for you to keep an eye on the child while working in the main house." Caroline looked anxiously at the businesswoman. She realized that her chances of getting the truth were slim. Sam had obviously not thought out his strategy well enough, so she was going to have to take care of 2 people, maybe even 3, considering her son. Which meant she'd have to do whatever it took to win Mrs. Wilson over, to convince her that she was the best choice she could make. I could take Kyle to work with me, Caroline suggested. But whenever possible, of course, I'll be very careful never to put him in danger. Mrs. Wilson was clearly interested in what was going on. Well, keep up the good work, my dear. I'm beginning to like it. Caroline drew in her breath. Well, I know you have a big house. I'm good at that sort of thing. I can do the dishes, I can clean, I can do the laundry. I can even cook simple meals and tend the garden, Caroline continued. And you even have references? Mrs. Amanda Wilson asked. A shadow of doubt crept into Caroline's mind. Goodness, what exactly does this woman mean by that? Am I supposed to become a maid here? What other references are there? Is that what Sam is up to? Had he lost his mind? Finally, pulling herself together, she decided to continue the conversation, not even for her own sake, but for Sam's, who was in grave danger. I don't have any references, she admitted. And I've never had a steady job. Mrs. Wilson thought for a moment, then nodded. I'll consider your candidature. Please wait for me in the lobby. Caroline thanked the lady of the house and left the room with her son. As they sat down on the small sofa, she felt a bitter mixture of hope and despair. She had done all she could, after all, but was it enough to help her husband? Tired from the long journey, Kyle laid his head in his mom's lap and covered his eyes. Caroline began stroking his hair, thinking over everything that had happened to her in the last few hours. Finally, the door of the room opened again. Mrs. Wilson stood on the threshold. Caroline. Caroline stood up, her heart hammering like a hunted rabbit. I have one more question I must ask you. Only let your son stay here, said the landlady. Caroline nodded, and Mrs. Wilson gestured her back into the living room. Kyle looked anxiously at his mom. I wonder what you two are going to talk about, he whispered. Caroline didn't know the answer to that question, but she was determined to get a place in this house as a guest or housekeeper. What did it matter, as long as Sam got his problems sorted out and took her and her son back as soon as possible? Caroline smiled cheerfully at Kyle and followed the businesswoman. Mrs. Wilson stood by the desk holding an envelope. Caroline, she said, you mentioned that your husband asked you to stay at my house for a while. Caroline's eyes widened in surprise. What kind of a strange question was that? Of course. She nodded. Mrs. Wilson paused, then slowly handed her guest a tightly sealed envelope. This is your husband's letter, she said. It was delivered to me a couple of days ago. I didn't want to say it right away, but I think you should know it. Caroline's lips trembled as she took the envelope in her hands. As she did so, she felt a nasty chill run through her body. Printing the letter in the presence of the landlady, Caroline ran her eyes over it and almost lost her senses. What was written in the letter shocked her to the core. After reading it, Caroline looked at the landlady. She could not bring herself to utter a word out of shock. Mrs. Wilson kindly did it for her. Well, do you realize now what really happened? Your husband simply betrayed you and sold you to me, said Mrs. Amanda Wilson. Yes, it's not the Middle Ages, of course, but he did it because of a debt he never repaid. Why on earth did I give him that money? I suppose I felt sorry for his late father, Andrew. He was a funny man, though. The apple of the tree, as they say. Caroline sighed convulsively. What am I supposed to do now? What if I refuse? Mrs. Wilson looked at her guest ironically. I don't think that would help. No, I'm not going to shackle you, and I'm not going to hold you by force either. I'm not an old-time landlady. but you'll still have to pay some of your debt. Or rather, work it off and then we'll see. I don't think you'll want to go back to your husband after this. Besides, Sam got his father's inheritance. Where did he put the money? Caroline shook her head in denial. But how would she know the answer to that question? Realizing that she couldn't get away from paying Sam's debt, Caroline turned and walked back down the hall, feeling betrayed and forgotten. Kyle was waiting for her on the couch with a mournful expression on his face. "But what's wrong?" he asked. She looked at him tearfully, unable to utter a word. Thoughts raced through her head, mixed with emotions she couldn't voice out loud, especially in front of her son. Instead of words, she wrapped her arms around Kyle and buried her face in his thick blonde hair. The future she had tried so desperately to save was now once again in jeopardy. Caroline sank to the edge of the couch, wrapping her arms around her face. She relived what had started it all, and mentally traveled back to a few hours ago, when she had left home with her young son at her husband's behest. The traffic on the motorway connecting the two cities was very busy during rush hour. A young woman and her 6-year-old son were among other passengers on a crowded bus traveling on the highway. Despite his mother's request, the boy did not want to sleep and kept asking, "Mom, when are we going to get there? You said the time on the road will pass quickly, and we are like turtles dragging." Caroline looked at her son with undisguised affection. "That's right, Kyle. If you'd gone to bed, the time would have really flown by. And now you're counting every kilometer?" "I see. All right, I'm going to try to sleep. I'll just cover my eyes." The boy agreed. Caroline's face was pale and swollen with tears, and her eyes, like a mirror of the soul, reflected the unspeakable pain she felt sitting at the end of the cabin with her son. She waited patiently when she arrived at her final destination, what awaited them there, and why her husband had insisted on this particular journey. What had happened in his business that he sent his family to a neighboring town, and to complete strangers. Caroline didn't know the answer to that question, but the conversation with Sam was forever etched in her memory. Her husband began it a week ago, telling about a serious audit conducted within the walls of his firm. "You and Kyle need to go away for a while. Naturally, I'm running the business alone right now, but you never know. Maybe my partners won't forgive me by mistake. I mean, they're close to criminals, with a crowbar behind their backs. And you're my weakness. I can use you to make any decision I want." "How can that be? I thought you were doing so well. What about Andrew's inheritance?" Caroline objected. Sam bit his lip painfully and, trying not to meet his wife's gaze, said, "Oh, what did he leave there? Just tears. Business with these pennies certainly cannot save. But he was a millionaire when he was alive." Caroline wondered. Sam shook his head. "A millionaire? No way. Dad had at least a dozen mistresses. That's how much money he spent on all of them. He seemed to have forgotten about me." Caroline looked at her husband with concern. "Can't we get out of it? Take out a loan or something? Do you want me to put it on me so I don't ruin your credit history?" No, that won't work, Sam said. "I'll leave Kyle with my friends the Wilsons for now. I'll give them a note." "Why can't we just call? But what's with the old-fashioned stuff like letters and notes? You should have sent a telegram." Caroline objected. There was a pause in the room for a moment, which the hapless businessman did not allow to linger. "Caroline, why are you being such a little girl? What if I'm being followed or my phone tapped? What then? You don't know what serious people I've decided to go up against in court. They'll do anything to stop me, So go to the Wilsons and don't worry about a thing. You stay there for a month or two, and then I'll pick you up myself. I'll come and pick you up in my own car." Caroline looked at her husband doubtfully and went to pack her bags. She'd always been an understanding wife, whether Sam was in a bad way or a good one. She was always there to help and support him. It's just a pity her husband's parents disliked her at first sight. But then again, who's having a good time these days? Knowing that Sam would be picking them up in a month or two, Caroline didn't take much with her, just a couple of suitcases. And if she needed anything, she could buy more. She'll always have her cards with her. You can't rely on the owners of the house for everything. You've got to have a conscience. To Caroline's surprise, Sam didn't agree to drive them to the Wilsons in person. Wouldn't it be better to take the bus? It's safer. What if they're being followed? They're the kind of people who'd bug a car and put a wire on a phone. So don't call without a reason, unless it's for a good reason. Caroline looked sadly at her husband, as if she were leaving not for a while but for good. The coarse roar of the bus engine blended with the familiar atmosphere of the cabin, the voices of the other passengers, and the melodies of their smartphones. It was early spring. It was early spring. It was quite cool in the cabin. The explanation was simple for some unknown reason. The heating in the bus was defective. Clutching her son tightly to her, she tried to warm him with her fragile body. Kyle rested his face against her shoulder. They were shivering from the cold and the fact that they had to leave their home under the cover of night darkness like criminals. Their suitcases stood on the floor at their feet, symbolizing their once tight-knit family. The contents of the suitcases represented the pathetic remnants of their lives: dresses for Caroline, a pair of jeans for Kyle, a few t-shirts, a toy robot, and pictures of those happy days that seemed gone forever. Caroline looked at her son and her heart overflowed with tenderness and longing. Until a couple of days ago, their world had been filled with the love and care of loved ones. And husband Sam had seemed like a wonderful father and loving husband. So how could all of that change in one day? Sam's once tender touches were replaced by reproachful looks, and warm words were replaced by a disturbing indifference. Of course, Caroline realized that work problems and a huge debt that was dragging their family down were to blame. Sam had made such a difficult decision, and their life had plummeted into the abyss. She lost her husband and her home, and the future now seemed to her devoid of meaning and rainbow hopes. Her only consolation was her beloved son, who now looked at her with tear-filled eyes. Meanwhile, the bus continued on its way, flowing into the busy motorway like a yellow submarine. Taxi drivers dived in and out, and huge lorries followed the route, laden with rubble or sand. There were enough ordinary cars, too. Rush hour. The traffic was so dizzying. Caroline looked sadly out the window, but her thoughts were far away. She remembered her wedding day, when she and Sam had exchanged rings and solemnly promised to love each other for the rest of their lives. She also remembered Kyle's first birthday, when her heart had been filled with boundless joy. Unfortunately, now it all seemed like a pleasant dream that had nothing to do with reality. Caroline clenched her fingers into fists and sighed sadly. She had to be strong, and for her son's sake, she had to endure everything, fight to the end. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her mind, but she pushed them away, thinking only of one thing: how they would be received at the Wilson home, and dozed off. At one of the stops, Kyle smacked his lips sweetly and moved. Caroline gently stroked him and whispered, "It's going to be okay. It's going to get better." Finally, the bus pulled up to the right stop. Caroline picked up the suitcases and woke a sleepy Kyle. Mother and son stepped onto the half-empty bus stop and looked around the unfamiliar city, which seemed hostile. It seemed as if they were being watched from every window and every storefront. In a way, it was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. "Well, here we are," Caroline said. "Mum, I don't like it here." "It looks weird," Kyle remarked. In spite of the doubt and fear in Caroline's soul, there was a small spark of hope. Sure, the future seemed uncertain, but she was determined to create a bright, fulfilling new life for them. Caroline picked up the suitcases and led her son to a nearby taxi. She resented the taxi driver for not helping her with her things. He just sat there and waited until she loaded her luggage into the boot. Yeah, his upbringing didn't allow him to at least get his arse out of the seat, she thought regretfully. When everyone got into the car, Caroline looked at her reflection in the window. There was almost nothing left of her usual confident, happy woman. I'm only 28, and I look at least twice as old, Caroline thought. But there was still a light in her eyes, even in the darkness of the coming uncertainty. Where are you going? The cabbie asked as politely as possible. 23 Rosewood Street. Caroline answered. The driver nodded, and the car started, taking her and her son into a new, uncharted world. As luck would have it, the weather had been bad this morning. First there was a strong, bone-chilling wind. And then the sky was covered with clouds, which Caroline herself thought did not bode well. Her premonition did not fail her, and soon the rain came down with a loud thud, drumming drearily on the roof of the car as it moved slowly through the crowded city streets. It was a little stuffy in the cramped cabin. Kyle sat in the back, clutching the tattered teddy bear tightly in his small hands. His son didn't want to put it in his suitcase, saying that it would be boring and dreary there. The taxi driver turned out to be a cordial middle-aged man with an open, friendly face and expressive gray eyes that seemed to glow with understanding and warmth. At first, the chauffeur's attempts to get his silent passengers to talk were unsuccessful. The atmosphere in the cabin was heavy, as if the hardships of life of mother and son did not allow them to relax. Finally, the driver could not stand it and dared to break the prolonged pause. Yes, life is a complicated thing, he said in a soft voice. Sometimes it throws up surprises we're not prepared for. Caroline nodded and looked at the monotonous city buildings outside the window. And you're visiting, aren't you? I'm sorry to intrude. I just saw the suitcase and realized everything. The taxi driver went on. Yes, we are. But I don't feel like going there at all, she replied. The taxi driver nodded sympathetically. I understand. I myself was in such a situation not so long ago. I wanted to visit my daughter, but my wife drove me away. At the mention of the child, Caroline became visibly animated. Yeah? Why would she do that? Are you two divorced? The driver shook his head sadly. Oh, how can I put it? I used to have a family and a job I loved. And then there was an accident and I lost my legs. I couldn't work anymore. My wife left me, took the kids and left. The driver continued. It was only now that Caroline noticed something she hadn't seen at first. The car was manually driven. There was a distinctive mark on the windscreen, signifying the driver's disability. At the same time, Caroline realized that she was mentally judging the chauffeur for not helping her load her suitcases. Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't even think, whispered the woman. The taxi driver smiled. You know, I thought I had finally broken down. But then I met a wonderful man who literally revived hope in my soul, he said, falling silent. Caroline looked at him sympathetically, waiting for him to continue his story. A friend of mine, continued the taxi driver, was also an invalid. True, he didn't lose both his legs in an accident like I did, but he still had a hard time. But he didn't give up and founded an organization that helped other disabled people. At that moment, the driver turned to the passenger, his brown eyes shining with hope. I don't know what you're going through right now, he said, but I want you to know that you are not alone. There will be people who will want to take care of you and help you with everything. Caroline sighed sadly. She could no longer hold back the tears that ran down her cheeks in salty streams. The taxi driver took out a packet of tissues and handed it to her mum. Don't cry, please, it's going to be okay, Kyle pleaded. The cabbie smiled. The truth is spoken from the mouth of a babe. There are times when tears are the best medicine. Embarrassed, Caroline turned back to the window. Convulsive sobs still shook her body. Understanding his mum's condition, Kyle pressed his whole body against her, wrapping his arms around her neck. The driver looked at them with undisguised sympathy. He realized that his words were just tiny seeds of hope planted in the soil of despair. And he also took the long way round on purpose to let the passenger calm down and come to her senses. When the rain finally stopped and the sun peeked out from behind the clouds, the chauffeur drove the couple to the house they wanted. Caroline sighed and, stepping outside, struggled to get one suitcase after another out of the cabin. "Thank you," she said. "Your story really helped me. I don't even know your name." "I'm Caroline Smith." The driver smiled. "Glad to have helped. I wish you well, and may this house give you the welcome you deserve. And my name is John Swan. You can ask the dispatcher or any of the other cabbies. Everyone in town knows me. I'm the only one without legs." Caroline nodded and picked up the suitcases. Kyle stood beside her, holding a teddy bear. Caroline had bought it at a sale a couple of years ago and had fallen in love at first sight. Thanking the taxi driver for his help, she walked to the gate where her new life awaited her. Pressing the bell button, Caroline Smith turned round and gave the chauffeur, John Swan, a sweet smile. John smiled back, and in that moment Caroline realized that she had a long road ahead of her. But now she wasn't alone. And now, sitting on the sofa in the living room of the Wilson house, she felt that her life would never be the same again. To Mrs. Amanda Wilson's credit, she did not rush her guest with an answer and waited patiently for her to make up her mind. Finally, weighing up the pros and cons, Caroline said, "I agree. Just don't kick us out and please let my son rest from the road. And I'm ready to get to work right now. What do you have to do?" The landlady splashed her hands, but no heroics. "Sweetie, go to the kitchen and make yourself some coffee and feed your son. But do it yourself. I'm sorry, but I don't have any servants except the guard. And then I'll tell you what to do next." Caroline nodded obediently, accepting the rules of the game. What was she supposed to do? Sam had tricked her and set her up in every way he could. Firstly, he'd changed her mobile phone number. Secondly, he'd blocked her bank card, leaving her with no money. Not only that, but he had sneaked Caroline a large note from the secret compartment of her wallet to completely deprive his wife of a choice, a scoundrel, to say the least. After listening to the landlady's advice, Caroline went to the kitchen and made Kyle breakfast from what she could find in the fridge. As she did so, she was confronted in the doorway by a trim man in his 40s, who appeared to be Mrs. Amanda's husband, Brad. He dryly threw her a greeting upon meeting her and walked out of the kitchen. Well, Mrs. Amanda's no stranger to the world. Husband's about 20 years younger, Caroline thought. As it turned out later, her instincts were right. Brad was indeed Mrs. Amanda's husband, 17 years apart in age. However, Caroline herself was not surprised by this fact. Rich people are often prone to excesses both in business and in their personal lives. Caroline had to start her first day of work with cleaning, sending her son to the maid's house. She got down to business, doing her best to make the floors shine like a new coin. While Caroline worked tirelessly, her ex-husband Sam Smith sat in his office sipping whiskey with his secretary Angelina, who had recently become his flatmate. Secretly, of course, but that didn't change the point. In the spacious dark wood office, Sam felt just fine. With his hands folded on the desk in front of him, he stared at one point. Angelina was seated in the chair next to him. Their faces were practically touching, expressing complete satisfaction and harmony. "Well, we got rid of her," the secretary said with a smile. "Now you're practically free. You can get a divorce and move on to a new life," Sam said. "And I'm grateful to you for that. We've earned our happiness." Angelina grinned, and Sam continued. "My father offered me a fortune to leave her a month before he died. In the will, of course, the main criteria for getting money from my father was that he divorce Caroline. He didn't like her very much. The notary explained it to me straight away. If I didn't get rid of her, I wouldn't get the money. So I decided to take the Wilson scam. I didn't want to sell it to just anyone, explained the businessman. Yeah, you're a good boy. You put her in a rich family where she will have everything she needs, Angelina remarked. Then they both laughed. I think you did the right thing, she added. This is a chance for us to start a new life. Yes, it is. The main thing is that nothing will interfere with us now. The lovers sat for a while longer and then stood up and kissed. Smiling flirtatiously, Angelina picked up her purse and headed for the exit. I have to go, she said. But I'll be back soon. I can't wait. Sam replied with a romantic lilt in his voice. When Angelina walked out, he closed the door. Then he went to the window and followed his mistress with his gaze. She was tapping her heels on the pavement in her orange coat. She looked expensive and chic. Dad was right, Sam thought. He knew right away that Caroline wasn't right for me. A wise man sees from afar. He thought about what had happened. He'd gotten rid of his wife, but he felt no regret or guilt. Let Caroline think that I'm still taking care of her and my son and fighting the competition. Well, I'm having fun with Angelina, and then we'll see. Of course, Caroline had no idea about all this, working up to her seventh sweat in the Wilson house. She was doing her best to keep her mistress happy. But Mrs. Amanda's young husband still grumbled that the floor wasn't clean enough. He also said that Caroline's efforts were useless. Of course, it wasn't pleasant to hear. After all, her grandmother taught her to cook. Working in the city canteen, she cooked better than many others. At the same time, Caroline waited stubbornly for word from Sam. What if he came to his senses, came back for us the same day? That would be great, wouldn't it? But then how could he leave his wife and son? But why? Was it for the inheritance? Caroline's mood soured at the mere thought of it. At that moment, her son Kyle came in from the guest house. Caroline hugged him and pulled him close, realizing how hard it was for him. They were silent for a moment, but there was more than silence in their eyes. Do you remember when Grandma said I was fat? Kyle asked. Caroline shuddered and could barely keep from crying. She had tried for so long to forget those unpleasant words spoken by her mother-in-law, Mrs. Kate. And Grandma also said that my legs were too short for a boy and that people would laugh at me. Kyle continued in a voice shaking with excitement. Caroline's heart clenched painfully. She immediately remembered how Mrs. Kate had made jokes about her son's weight and appearance. Tears sprang to her eyes. She still couldn't believe that her own mother-in-law had spoken such cruel words to her son, to her grandson, on top of that. She also said that I was a bad mother and that I didn't know how to raise children. Caroline whispered with a sigh, wiping away a tear. I'm not fat or ugly, Kyle said, looking her in the eye. And you're not a bad mom. You're the best mom in the world. Caroline smiled through her tears and hugged her son tightly, knowing that their love was stronger than any adversity they had ever encountered with their mother-in-law and father-in-law. Mrs. Kate had disliked Caroline from the first moments of meeting her. She had mocked her for her simple dress and slip-on shoes, brought her to tears. And for what? To convince her son that they weren't a couple. Sam began to act stealthily and brought it to the logical end, the registry office and a fancy wedding in a restaurant. It's been 8 years, but it feels like an eternity. Not only had her mother-in-law not changed her attitude towards Caroline, but she had become even worse. She must have had something to do with this, Caroline thought, picking up the mop again. Kyle sighed sadly and went back to the guest house so he wouldn't be in his mother's way. At that, Caroline's heart nearly burst with pity. And at that very moment, the Smith family's cozy living room was permeated with a peculiar silence and tension. At the long dining table sat the recently widowed Mrs. Kate and her son Sam. The woman's haughty gaze expressed mixed emotions. In the first place, it read pride. Secondly, relief. Sam's face, on the other hand, showed traces of recent anxiety. "Son, I'm so glad you finally decided to divorce Caroline," Mrs. Kate began. "To me, you deserve better than to live with that bastard." Sam nodded, trying not to think that his victory over his ex-wife had been won in a dishonest way. He'd set Caroline up by pretending to save them so he could get his hands on his father's inheritance and absolve himself of the debt. Caroline, of course, fell into his clever trap and went to a complete stranger's house, not knowing that she would work in their house for food and shelter. "You're so strong and smart," his mother continued, "and you'll always find a way out of any situation." Sam sat still, his eyes fixed on the pattern on the tablecloth. "I know it's been hard for you," Mrs. Kate said, "but it's all over now. You're free, and soon you'll meet a woman who will be a worthy match for you." Sam looked at his mother with mute reproach. She didn't know the whole truth. He had sacrificed his reputation, his marriage, his son for his own greed. There was no regret in his soul, though, just a slight nostalgia that could easily be relieved with a bottle of something. Sam's throat was dry. He suddenly wanted to get out of here, to escape his mother's gaze and find peace at the bottom of a bottle. Still, he forced himself to sit still, nodding his head like a puppet. "I'm so proud of you," Mrs. Kate said. "You are everything I ever dreamed of seeing in my son." "But I have to go," Sam lied without blinking an eye and got up from the table. Mrs. Kate frowned. This was clearly not part of her plans. After all, since her husband's death, she had become increasingly lonely, especially in the evenings when she would look at the family album. "Where are you going, son? We spend so little time together, and you're off again." But Sam only grinned, heading for the door. Well, he couldn't tell his mother that Angelina was waiting for him in a cheap hotel. A week passed, followed by another. Without realizing it, Caroline had become accustomed to the Wilson household. She had accepted the fact that she was now working as a servant to pay her husband's debt. Of course, Caroline could have run away the first night. But where would she go? Her parents were long gone, drowned in the abyss of addiction and alcohol, and her friends were unlikely to take her in with their child. And to wander around with her son in her arms? No, it's not for her. Better to keep working. Besides, Mrs. Amanda wasn't so bad. Except for her young husband, his eyes cold and angry, as if he envied her or blamed her for something. Sam, on the other hand, was rapidly moving towards divorce. He'd hired the right people to make sure everything went smoothly. And he did it for a reason. He would never let Caroline Smith get a share of his assets or alimony for Kyle. It's her own fault. If she wanted a baby, fine. And Sam offered the dignified option of terminating the pregnancy, once and for all. But no, Caroline was stubbornly insistent. Let her deal with the consequences. Caroline didn't know any of this. She worked hard to pay for her husband's sins. One day, Mrs. Amanda Wilson suggested she take a day off. "Why do you work so hard without a break? I don't want you to be sick in a month. Go to the park or go shopping. I'll give you some money. Am I heartless? And take Kyle so he can get some rest too." "Really? Thank you so much." Caroline thanked him and hurried to tell her son the good news. Soon the two of them were strolling leisurely along the winding paths of the city park, feeding the squirrels with corn sticks. On this warm spring day, the park was full of joy and fun. Children laughed and raced across the green lawn. Couples were sitting on benches, chatting about everything and enjoying each other's company. Caroline rejoiced with everyone else, especially her motherly joy at the sight of a happy Kyle. Suddenly her attention was drawn to a motionless figure sitting on a bench under the shade of a huge chestnut tree. It was clearly a homeless man. His clothes looked shabby and dirty, and his face was overgrown with the thick stubble of a man who hadn't known a razor in a long time. He sat motionless, staring at a small fountain, a couple of dozen meters away from hers, and seemed aware of his own insignificance. Caroline's heart clenched. She walked over to the bench and cautiously sat down beside him. To her great surprise, the vagrant didn't even notice her presence, his mind deep in brooding thoughts. "I'm sorry," Caroline asked softly. "Are you all right?" The stranger turned his head slowly and met her gaze. His eyes, sky azure in color, were full of pain and sadness. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Caroline with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Had she really sat down next to him to talk to him? What would her son say when he saw it? Would the boy point his finger at him and call him a bum? "Caroline," she introduced herself, extending her hand without a shadow of doubt. "What's your name?" "Michael," the tramp said hoarsely, avoiding looking her straight in the eye. "Nice to meet you, Michael," she said. "Is there anything I can do for you?" He didn't answer, but instead mumbled something unintelligible and turned away, staring again at the fountain where the children were frolicking. Caroline remained silent, not wanting to disturb his peace. She simply sat beside him, offering her silent company. The minutes dragged on, the tension between Michael and Caroline building. "Why are you here? Why do you live on the street?" Caroline stealthily switched to you. Michael sighed sadly. "It's a long story, and I don't think you'll be interested in hearing it. And I'm warning you, I don't have a place to live. Black realtors did their best. I don't have a residence permit. But I'm here so my son can get some fresh air. And I don't want your property." "I could listen to you," Caroline suggested. Michael looked at his new acquaintance in disbelief, then began his story. For the next half hour, he could hardly contain his emotions, telling how, as a surgeon, he had lost first his job and then his wife and daughter. In doing so, Michael skillfully described his despair and the shame he felt at being on the street. Caroline listened without interrupting. In truth, she was shocked by Michael's story and saw the pain in his eyes. "I was set up by an envious man," he continued. "I was planted in the ward with marked money along with stolen medication. I tried to justify myself, but then it turned out that my father, an ex-recidivist, had already stabbed someone to death. So they drew a parallel. Why should he, the son of a criminal, become a successful surgeon? You know, no oranges are born from an aspen. And I broke. I've been ashamed of my father all my life. I got probation, fired from my job. Mr. Brown did his best, took my place. What about him now? I don't know," Michael summarized. When he finished, Caroline was silent for a moment. Finally, she said, "Michael, I'm sorry you had to go through all this, but life doesn't end." "Thank you," he said. "I know I'm not a nice person." "You're beautiful, not on the outside, but on the inside," Caroline whispered, embarrassed. He only laughed. "How can I be beautiful on the inside? After what I've done drinking, partying, stooping to the level of a street hobo. Son of a convict. That's where I belong." "Well, you've opened your soul to me," Caroline said, "and that makes you brave and handsome." He looked at her. A spark of hope, hitherto unknown, glittered in his eyes. "Do you really think so?" the tramp asked. "Yes, I am absolutely sure of it," Caroline replied. They sat in silence for a while, thinking about what they had said. And then, when Kyle came running up to her, out of breath, it was time to go. But Caroline wanted Michael to know. "I'll remember you." "Thank you. Really, I'm sorry if I dumped my problems on you." "It's not a problem at all," Caroline said and turned to leave. But the tramp suddenly grabbed her arm. "Wait," he said. "I have something, and I'd like to give it to you." At that moment, Michael put something in her hand and gently squeezed her slender fingers into a fist. "It's my gift to you. A way of saying thank you," he said. Caroline unclenched the fist and looked at her palm. There was a small wooden cross on it. "Thank you," she said. "It's just beautiful." Michael smiled. "God willing, it will bring you and your son good luck." She put the cross in her pocket and, taking Kyle's hand, walked away. When she looked over her shoulder, she saw that Michael was still sitting on the bench, watching them. Caroline waved at the tramp, and he waved back. The birds sang in Caroline's heart. Perhaps at that moment she felt that she had been able to give this downcast man a flame of hope in his heart. Afterwards, she never forgot her meeting with Michael and often thought about him and how their chance encounter had changed her outlook on life. Wanting to help him, Caroline made more frequent visits to the park to see Michael. Sometimes she brought food in plastic containers, not scraps in the literal sense, but leftovers from the table. What was wrong with that? Especially since Michael was happy to eat. He also befriended Kyle and gave him wood-carved crafts every time he saw him. One day, seeing another toy in the boy's hands, Mrs. Amanda Wilson's husband, Mr. Brad, remarked, "Will you stop bringing all that rubbish into the house? Look at that. Take it all back where you found it." "Okay," Uncle Brad replied little Kyle, who really disliked the man. Kyle also had a secret, one that he was afraid to tell even his mom. And it started with this. That afternoon, Kyle was in the kitchen cupboard looking for something tasty. His little hands were reaching for packages of biscuits and candy. A sudden noise from the cooker made him freeze and turn his head. His husband, Mr. Brad, stood at the table with a bowl of soup in his hands. The man's once pleasant features were suddenly distorted in a cold grimace. His eyes seemed to have turned black. The evening light created an eerie glare on Mr. Brady's face as he hurriedly pulled a clear bag from his pocket and, in a sudden movement, dumped its contents into the soup. Kyle felt panic and terror rising in his little heart. The little boy knew this was not normal. This was not the way good people acted. Mr. Brad, who he had always thought was harmless, suddenly seemed alien and dangerous. The boy knew he was going to take this plate to Mrs. Amanda Wilson, which meant she could be in danger. Thoughts swirled around in Kyle's head like a hurricane. At that moment, fear and anger boiled up inside the boy, overpowering his instinct for self-preservation, and he climbed out of his hiding place and knocked the plate out of Mr. Brad's hands, which shattered into tiny pieces. "What have you done, you bastard?" Mr. Brad shouted. "I'm not a bastard. I saw you put something in the soup," Kyle wailed. The man's hostile gaze fixed on the child's face. Kyle instinctively recoiled, feeling fear clench his heart. But he didn't flinch and stood to the end. When Mrs. Amanda Wilson summoned him to her, the little boy laid it all out as it was. She wondered. She had no reason not to believe Brad. Kyle, on the other hand, children were often prone to fantasy. What if the little boy was some kind of dreamer? Like a lot of kids his age, Mrs. Amanda Wilson was confused, trying to make sense of what was happening. She personally collected the remains of the broken plate into a bag and took it to the rubbish bin outside. Brad, stunned and proud of his righteousness, didn't say a word. Kyle, however, took a moment to pull out the bag of plate shards and took it to his new acquaintance, Uncle Michael. After listening to the boy, the former doctor thought for a moment. "Well, I think we should give these samples for examination. I can't promise, but I have acquaintances in the right field. And not just acquaintances, but debtors. So don't worry, we'll take care of your Brad." "Thank you, Uncle Michael. You're a true friend," the boy whispered. It took a few days for the results to come back. Meanwhile, Caroline Smith received a divorce notice in the mail. Just like that, Sam had stripped her of everything she had. In absentia, but with all the legal formalities. He sold my son and me like a piece of property. How on earth do you find such scoundrels? Caroline thought. The tears sprang from her eyes of their own accord. All this was seen by Brad, who had long ago decided that Caroline and her backbreaker should be thrown out of the house on any pretext. If Caroline had known that Sam would be so cruel to her, would she have wasted her time with him? Damn him and his secretary mistress to hell. In the meantime, Brad had been blabbing to his wife that Caroline should be fired, and he did it with his usual slyness and invention. First, he accused his assistant of stealing money from his wallet, just out of nowhere, saying something she didn't do. "I've never seen that purse before," cried Caroline, but the anger of the landlady was unrelenting. "How dare you lie to me, you beggar? I gave you a home, I gave you a job. And what have you done in return? Get out, you thief." "My mom's not a thief. She's kind, honest," Kyle cried out with tears in his eyes. Brad only grinned. "All you vagrants are kind and affectionate at first, only to then bite the hand that feeds you." Tears welled up in Caroline's eyes. How could it be so? Is there no justice left in life at all? At that moment, there was a knock at the Wilson family home. Mrs. Amanda Wilson opened the door herself because she was going to send Caroline and the child out at the same time. She was surprised to see a police officer on the doorstep, along with an unpleasantly dressed man. At the sight of him, Brad turned pale. "Michael Warren, is that you?" The surgeon from the department. "I thought you were long gone." Michael smiled and instantly recognized his former colleague Brad Brown, who had set him up a few years ago and got him fired for some spurious reason. "I see you've got a good job, a good wife, a widow. That's what you dreamed of when you were working in surgery, that she would die and leave you an inheritance, along with Aladdin's cave. And to hasten that sweet moment, you tried to poison her, didn't you?" No, he's lying. His father was a convict himself. There's nowhere to test," shouted Brad. Mrs. Amanda Wilson looked the police officer in the eye and asked curtly, "Tell me, is this true?" The captain nodded in agreement. "Pure and simple. Michael, I remember from surgery. He saved me when all hands were down. I had peritonitis after I was wounded, and he came out. Now your husband bought poison on the black market. You can put a man to death in half an hour, and there's no trace of it in the blood." Realizing it was all over, Brad lowered his head and obediently put his wrists under the handcuffs. "I'm sorry, Caroline, I didn't know what I was doing," Mrs. Amanda Wilson said in a shaky voice. Caroline smiled and pulled Kyle close to her. She also gave the warmest look to Michael, whom she seemed to love with all her heart. About a week later, Caroline and Michael's lives showed the first signs of change as the case of the failed poisoning of a businesswoman became publicized. Michael Warren became a local celebrity in no time. At the same time, a talented surgeon immediately wanted to get in the ranks of their employees one of the best private clinics in the city. Michael did not think long, and to the great joy of Caroline and Kyle, accepted the invitation of the head doctor. As it turned out, for years of lack of practice, he had not lost his skills. His hands were still strong and confident. After the incident with Brad's exposure, Caroline stopped being a housekeeper for Mrs. Amanda Wilson. Now the kind-hearted mistress regarded her as her daughter, though not her own, but close in spirit. Having given up vagrancy, Michael again turned into a smiling young man, after which women turned round. But really loved him only Caroline, who 3 months later became his lawful wife. The wedding was attended by many friends, acquaintances, and even former colleagues of Michael, who once turned away from him, learning about the charges of crime, and John the same, deprived of legs taxi driver, which Michael's clinic as a gift presented the latest prosthetic devices. Looking at his happy parents, Kyle laughed happily and shouted bitter along with everyone else. but he didn't understand the meaning of the word at the time. But it didn't matter. The main thing is that the parents were happy. 5 years flew by imperceptibly. During this time in Caroline's life, many things had changed. Firstly, she gave birth to Michael's daughter, Mary, and secondly, she began to work in his clinic in an administrative position. What's the big deal? She's always been bright. It's all about desire and hard work. The rest will come. Caroline hadn't heard much about her ex-husband, Sam. Some said he'd gone on the run and fled abroad to escape creditors. Others said he'd fled to another city and started a new life. The truth came out later. And it was so shocking that Caroline couldn't contain her emotions. There were very few people in the clinic that day. Sitting in the office, filled with the smell of disinfectants, Caroline was waiting for the next client. She was wearing simple but elegant clothes. And in her eyes you could read the cordiality and sympathy for the distress of the patients. Suddenly the office door opened, and she saw her ex-husband Sam, who had been queuing in the waiting room. Caroline was amazed to see him in the clinic. Not only that, she couldn't believe until the last minute that it was her ex-husband. Deciding to break the long pause, Caroline asked, "Sam, what are you doing here?" "Here, hi. I came to see the doctor, as you can see," he said. "A doctor's appointment. What's wrong?" Caroline exclaimed. Sam answered with some embarrassment. "I'm not feeling very well. There are some health problems, and I decided to go to the doctor. As of late, I've started experiencing some severe headaches and I've even started passing out." Caroline nodded discreetly, then said that the examination and treatment will be carried out by her husband, Michael Voronov. Her heart was still pounding frantically in her chest. After their painful divorce, she had never seen Sam again. Here was the villainous fate once again decided to play a cruel trick on her. A mixed feeling of anxiety and anger filled her heart. On the one hand, Caroline wished him a speedy recovery, but on the other hand, the presence of this deceiver and scoundrel awakened deep-seated resentments in her soul. Now, however, Sam's face was pale and haggard. "I'm to be watched by your husband? So what now? Do I have to make a will? You'll probably want to kill me, won't you?" Sam asked in a husky voice. There was no remorse in his eyes, only cold calculation. Caroline's heart sank at that moment. She didn't want to show her emotions, but the bitterness of the past kept her in the dark. She remembered how Sam and her mother had systematically abused and insulted her during their married life, and then sold her to a wealthy family as an object, along with her young son. However, she did not show her displeasure. "What's wrong with my husband? I don't think he'll take revenge. Why should he? When he took the doctor's oath, did he say he'd pretend to be a doctor?" "What, take care of me?" Sam grinned. "You're doing everything you can to enjoy the sight of my helplessness right now." "You know, you shouldn't judge people by themselves," Caroline said. "I don't want to hurt anyone, not you, not your mother, not even your lover." "Don't lie to me," Sam said. "I know you too well to believe it. You've always been very vindictive. Are you jealous of my will? What if I'm gone and your man gets sued and sent to prison for life?" Caroline silently looked Sam in the eye and smiled. At first she wanted to explain to her ex-husband how wrong he was. But then she said simply and unabashedly what was on her mind at that moment. "You know, Sam, maybe you're right. I really am doing everything I can to make fun of you and bring you down. What did you want? You broke my heart, made me feel worthless, useless, sold me to strangers in the end, gave me away for debt like a piece of property. What do you expect from me now? Tears, sympathy. What are you and your husband going to do? Torture me on the operating table? Take out your anger like on lab rats or surgical practice dummies?" Sam wheezed. No, Caroline shook her head negatively. "I'm not stooping to your level. You came here for help. You'll get it as much as anyone else, no more, no less, in full. Look, Michael and I have our own lives and our own family. And your will is for mummy or mistress." Caroline retorted and turned away to the window. She had nothing more to say to him. In fact, their story had long since come to an end, though some things would still be forever in each other's past. Sam hesitated for a moment and then gave his consent to the operation. As it turned out later, he simply had no other choice. After all, Sam's mother had died a year ago. Angelina had left him even earlier. Moreover, he came to the clinic for a reason. He was going to be the lucky one who would be among those who were operated on by the leading surgeon for free, just one operation a month. Sam was lucky. His case fell into the category Mr. Warren was taking on. Back at home, Caroline honestly told her husband Michael everything without secrecy. Michael listened to her patiently and then agreed. Several weeks passed after that conversation. Sam was safely discharged from the hospital, but Caroline never heard from him again. And why live in the past when she was just enjoying her life, achieving new successes with her beloved husband and children? On her way home, Ellen overhears her mother talking to her fiancé, is stunned. Her mother was talking. "Why do you keep listening to your mother?" Grace questioned. "Ellen, you're 36 years old, you're an independent woman. Your mom is your dependent. And you're still indulging her whims. The years are ticking away. Soon you'll be out of the running for a baby. You're almost 40. Ellen smiled sadly. She realized that Grace was right. That if she didn't have a baby now, she could say goodbye to that dream. She had never talked to her mother about having a baby, but in her heart she thought of a baby, her baby, her baby, so dear, smelling of milk and happiness. Try to find someone to have a baby with. Grace admonished her friend. There are only alcoholics, drug addicts, and men of non-traditional orientation around. You won't give birth to a child from the first man you meet, or you'll have a sick child or a child with a bad heredity, and you'll have to raise it yourself. So it should be taken seriously. And do you think that on me lame someone stole? Ellen doubted. Maybe just who? Drunk, and even then only for once. Drunken conception, I'm afraid. What if there's something wrong with the baby? Then his life, as well as mine, will now go down the drain. That's not true. Grace objected. Ellen, you're beautiful. Yes, pretty, but beautiful. It's just that your mommy makes you self-conscious about yourself. You know how our political economy teacher was hitting on you in high school, and you turned him down. Grace, come on. I was only 18 and he was 36. He seemed like an old man to me. And now you're 36 and you're going to say you're old? Sometimes I'm ashamed of myself when I see how big kids my peers have. I don't have any. You're wrong. Then why'd you blow off Dan from our class? He was only 2 years older than you. Yeah, Dan and I were in love. But it wasn't until he introduced me to his mom that I found out the first night that she already hated me. I went to offer my help in the kitchen, Ellen continued. And then I was stopped by Dan's mom's words. I overheard them talking. Are you out of your mind? Dan's mom said. Where did you get that ugly girl? What can she do? What can she do? And Dan told her. I don't want anyone else. I love Helene, and I'll marry her. When I heard that, I ran out of the apartment without warning. Do you know, Grace, how much it hurt? Then Ellen sighed. I don't care anymore. I've accepted that married life isn't for me. If normal women can't make a life for themselves, what about me? You didn't tell me about this, Grace said, confused. What's to say, Grace? I know I'm ugly. So what? Dan turned you down right away? No, on the contrary, he urged me to marry him. But I hesitated. and my mom supported me in my doubts. She said to me, "You're lame, Helene. It's not for me to remind you of that. Accept it. It's a great handicap, and no one needs you but me. Vaughn, even your father, as soon as he had a normal son by his mistress, he abandoned you and me. You want to be abandoned all the time? Then marry your Dan. And you don't want to be abandoned? Live with me, I'll never leave you, I won't betray you." "You're a fool, Ellen," Grace concluded. "Your mom was just afraid to be alone. If Dan had left you, you'd have a child. And maybe even more than one. Maybe he wouldn't have left you. What's that supposed to mean?" "I know I'm an idiot," Ellen nodded. "They say you should listen to your parents. They don't give you bad advice. And then I regretted 100 times that I listened to my mom. I don't know how she will react to the fact that I still want a child and will strive to get pregnant and give birth to a baby. Only if she's against it this time. I won't listen to her," Ellen said firmly. "Are you out of your mind?" Ellen's mother, Lexi, was outraged. "Having a baby at 36, you're without a husband. Only a crazy person would do that." "And I am crazy," Ellen retorted. "You've been telling me that my whole life. I'm not ugly, that's why I didn't get married. But I can have a child, which is what I'm going to do." "You can't afford it," Lexi said. "And then, even if you do, how are you going to work and raise a child? Are you relying on me? I'll tell you right now, you can't count on me. I've had enough of you." "Calm down, Mom. I'm not counting on anyone," Ellen replied. "Are you pregnant already?" Lexi asked, looking at her daughter point blank. "Not yet, but I'll do my best in that direction. And your moaning is not going to stop me," Ellen said firmly. "I've raised a good daughter who doesn't consider me," Lexi said hysterically. "Are you going to go to the bar to have a baby? Who needs a limp?" Ellen realized that her mother was on a rampage. And if she, Ellen, didn't leave the house for a while, her mother would drive herself to the emergency room with her tantrums. And Ellen didn't want that. She knew that then she would listen to her mother for 6 months, what a bad daughter she was, and that she almost brought her to a heart attack. As soon as the front door slammed, Lexi immediately came to her senses. Ellen was gone. There's no one to throw tantrums now. She had to think things through and stop her daughter's plans. After all, if the baby was born, Ellen would be on maternity leave, and almost all of her money would go toward it. Lexi knew it would take a lot of money to raise a child, and she wasn't used to denying herself anything. She was only 59 years old, and she wasn't about to turn into an old woman. Lexi's pension was small, but Ellen's paycheck was big. And Lexi's mother was happy to spend her daughter Ellen's money on herself, especially since her daughter didn't need much. Ellen knew that with her lame leg, no amount of dressing up would help her. Lexi, on the other hand, updated her closet every year and went to resorts twice a year. But if the baby came, Lexi would lose all of that. So she felt she had to stop her daughter and not support her delusion with a baby. "A baby will destroy my whole personal life," Lexi thought. "And I've already been deprived of it. I'm not going to let this baby come into the world. Ruin my life." Going to Grace, Ellen's friend, was not something Lexi wanted to do. She tried to see Grace on neutral territory to avoid interfering with Grace's family life. Now it was evening, and Grace was with her family. Plus, Ellen wasn't going to be home tonight. She knew that if she came home, her mother would throw an all-night tantrum. Ellen decided to call her paternal brother Alex, who she had been friends with since childhood, something her mother hated. Lexi hated Alex with a fierce hatred, believing that he was the reason her father had left the family. At first, Ellen thought so too, but as she grew up, she began to realize that her father couldn't stand her mother's selfish nature, around which the whole world should revolve. "Hi, Alex. Are you alone tonight, or are you waiting for someone?" Ellen asked. Alex was 7 years younger than Ellen. He had his own choker, which he was paying off on the mortgage, but he wasn't married and was quite independent. "Hi, sis. Who should I wait for but you?" Alex answered. "Don't pretend. The girls must not leave the apartment. I've taken them all out so far," he laughed. "Come in. Old lady will have a chat and tea. Or maybe something stronger. I'd like to spend the night." "Will you take your sister in?" Ellen asked. "Where am I going to go? You can't choose your relatives," joked Alex. "Buy some bread on the way." "Good, I bought it. I'm waiting for you," Christian answered with a smile. "Are you and Lexi on the outs, as usual?" "Exactly," Ellen sighed. "But as you said yourself, you can't choose your relatives. She's a mother, after all. Except she doesn't like it when I get in the way of her plans. And I decided to do it my way and disobey her this time." "How dare you?" Christian said jokingly. "And what is this idea that has been born in your beautiful head? Apparently it affects Lexi's personal interests, since her selfishness can't bear the change that has come over her cloudless life. You want to tell me what this horror you and your mom are fighting about? Or is it a secret?" "It's no secret. I want to have a baby, and my mom didn't like it. And I know why. I'm not a girl anymore. I know what's going on." "That's news, sister." Christian smiled. "Is the baby already conceived?" "No," Helen answered sadly. "And this is probably the hardest part of my plan for the baby. I don't know how to attract men. I haven't been trained in this skill since I was a teenager. And from that age I was told that nobody needs me with my limp. I agree. I don't want a romantic relationship. But I just want to have a baby. Do you know how much I'd love him? With all my heart. I love him now. I don't know if I'm going to have my baby or not." "Don't worry, sister, you'll have your baby, because you'll be a good mother. It's all good. The only question is, who are you going to have a baby with? Help me with that, please." "You're really something, old woman." Christian laughed. "How can I help you? Can I introduce you to some of my friends?" Helene looked at her brother hopefully. "Please." "And what will you say to them?" "There's my sister." "Help me conceive a child," Ellen begged her brother. "You don't have to tell them anything. I'll try to have a relationship with one of them. If I can make it work, and the potential father of the baby won't even know he's having a child. You know me, Christian. I'm a man of my word." None of this pleased Christian, and he felt uncomfortable. But Ellen looked at him so hopeful that he couldn't refuse her. "All right," he said reluctantly. "I'll introduce you, and then you can deal with it yourself." "You're back," Lexi said angrily to her daughter. "She doesn't sleep at home. She's on the prowl for a substitute father. I never thought I'd live to see such shame." Ellen remained silent. She wasn't going to keep talking to her mother. She knew if she answered, Lexi would make a scene that would ruin her mood for the day. And she still had to work today. Tomorrow was Saturday, 2 days off. And Ellen didn't know where to escape her mother's wrath for those days. Right now she wished she'd bought a mortgage and stayed living with Lexi, who was drinking her blood one drop at a time. Ellen couldn't imagine living with her mother in the same apartment when the baby came. At least at work, she was taking a break from her. And with the baby coming, close contact was unavoidable. Ellen hadn't left work yet when Christian called her. "Hi. So, old lady, get your battle colors ready and come to my place tonight. The groomsmen will be there at 8 p.m., so I'm waiting." "I don't want any groomsmen," Ellen said sadly. "I only want a child." "Well, that's for you to figure out among yourselves who needs who and for what. My business is the side. I only play the role of matchmaker. Ellen, I hope you're not going to break me up with my friends by trying to get help." "I'm a delicate man," Ellen assured him. I'm not going to be pushy. If it works, it works. And if it doesn't, well, that's just the way it is. But we have to start somewhere. All right, I'll wait for you, Christian nodded. Ellen decided not to go home. She decided to come to her brother's house a little early, sit down at the table and not get up until she left, so that the guys would not immediately see her peculiarity and would not be repulsed by her straightforwardness. Ellen knew she was an interesting conversationalist and decided to use that very trump card first. In her position, one must proceed with caution. She knew that even without makeup she was pretty and even looked younger without makeup. So she only brushed her long red hair and applied gloss to her lips, which she did in vain. After all, while she was getting there, she bit off all the gloss from excitement. Here, let's set the table real quick, Ellen set a bag of food in the kitchen. Wow, what delicious things. Christian admired, pulling out the gastronomic delights. Under these conditions, I'm ready to bring you a beau every day. Every day won't work, Helene said seriously. If it doesn't work out today, I'll close this door and think about how to realize my dream. I hope they don't know I'm limping. No, they don't. Come on, I'm kidding. You know I'm always here for you, sis. Before he could say anything, the doorbell rang. Christian ran to open it, and Ellen remained seated at the table, hiding her foot under the table. Two of Christian's friends, one of whom introduced himself as Emmett and the other as Carl, walked into the kitchen where Helene, blushing with excitement, was sitting. Ellen, smiling, introduced herself. Ellen, the sister of that wonderful talker. And immediately, to dot all the I's, she added, "Why didn't you introduce us to your sister before?" Emmett said, smiling broadly. "You are selfish and greedy. You were afraid that they would steal Ellen from you." Everyone laughed at Emmett's jokes and supported the feast with noise and friendship. Emmett was more active towards Helen than Carl, but the pressure and youth of these boys scared her away. She looked at them and saw them as her brother Christian, and she did not see them as the father of her child. Ellen realized that she couldn't get into bed with any of them and take advantage of their youth. Now she decided for herself that the one who would give her a child must be at least the same age as her. And these are boys compared to her, one of whom she might have seduced but would not dare. "All right, guys. It was nice to meet your friends, but I have to go," Ellen said. "Christian, can you order me a cab?" Carl started to persuade Helene to stay and stay longer. He even volunteered to walk her home afterwards. But she flatly refused, which surprised Christian when she got up from the table and walked limping toward the front door. Blood rushed to Emmett's face. He stood before her red as a cancer and blinked confusedly, then pulled himself together and said, "I'll walk you to the cab." Ellen appreciated his gallantry. She saw in Emmett's and Carl's eyes pity for her. But she didn't want pity. She wanted the child. "No," Helene answered him. "Christian will take me. Forgive me for this adventure," Helene said sadly as they rode down the elevator. "Good friends you have. I never doubted you had such friends. You're the best brother I've ever had." "My birthday is in 2 months," Christian joked as usual, seeing that Helene was upset. "It's a little early for you to be singing dithyrambs to me," Helene Christian said. He hugged Helene and added, "Everything will be all right, sister. When I say that, it comes true. Do you believe me?" "I believe you," said Helene as she got into the cab. "I believe you the most. You're my favorite person. Thank you for being here." "That's a cool sister you have," Christian Emmett said when he returned to his friends. "What happened to her leg?" The last thing Christian wanted to talk about was Helene. "An injury," he answered briefly. "She's beautiful, but her eyes are very sad," Carl remarked. "I feel sorry for her." Christian didn't answer anything, and the friends realized that he didn't want to pursue the subject. "So how many rejections did you get today?" Lexi greeted her daughter with such hurtful words. Ellen regretted 100 times that she had prematurely initiated her mother into her plans. She didn't realize how many nerves she'd wind up on her mother's angry tongue. She knew her mother had never spared her. But that she could speak such derogatory words, Ellen didn't expect that. "Ma, have you decided to wear me out with your insults?" She couldn't stand it. "Foolish, my poor daughter. I'm trying to set you on the right path," Lexi said more gently. Ellen had a paycheck next week and Lexi had her own plans for that money. She understood that. That her daughter might get angry and her plans would be ruined. "Ellen, let's be reasonable. Why do you want to have a baby? We have a good life together. A child is a heavy burden to carry for the rest of your life. That's how I carry my burden, and I don't want you to suffer the same fate." "That's funny," Ellen laughed. "Mom, who doesn't know you in our life? I can't believe you've been busting your ass for me. I know what you care about. My money, which you spend most of the time on yourself. And when the baby comes, you'll have no access to my money," Ellen said. "So you're thinking about me?" "I don't. I know you, Mom. You've lived and lived all your life for yourself. And I'm your bank that you use. It's a good thing I was smart enough to stay in touch with Christian. Otherwise, I'd have no one to lay my head on. We're strangers, Mom. How painful it is to realize that. So you refuse to help your sick mother financially. And this is thanks to me for not putting you in boarding school. I wish you had put me in boarding school. Then I wouldn't owe you the debt you keep reminding me of. Don't be sarcastic, I'm asking you straight out. Are you refusing financial support? Mom, live on your pension like any other retiree. And if you need medicine, I'll buy it for you. If I can't live on my pension, I'll file for alimony. Lexi smiled wickedly. How about that? Suing your own mother? Do whatever you want. Ellen said tiredly, just don't count on my money anymore. I'll need it when the baby comes and I may have to move out. You fool. Lexi said something mean to Ellen. Who needs you limp? What normal man would go to bed with you? Ellen went into the bathroom, closed the door behind her, and turned on the water so the noise would drown out her mother's words, and she couldn't hear the curses she was sending her. Leaning over the sink, Ellen stared at her reflection. A tired woman, bruises under her eyes, the corners of her lips drooping, a haggard look in her eyes. "Hello, Scarecrow," she said to herself, "and the mother is not so wrong. Who needs a lame, damaged old maid?" There was an unusual silence in the apartment, and it strained no less, perhaps even more than the scandals with her mother. From her mother's behavior, Ellen realized that after her violent remarks, she was silent. At Ellen's appeals, Lexi kept silent, pressed her lips together and looked away, making it clear that she was ignoring her daughter. How long this would continue was unknown. Ellen was nervous, and she no longer had any energy or thoughts about how she would meet the potential father of the child. Maybe that's what the mother was counting on, she thought. Couldn't break me with words, so she found a more effective way. Yes, with this mood, it's not just thinking about a child you don't want to live. No, contact with the mother must be limited. We have to rent a place and leave her. Otherwise, she will bring me and herself to the unknown, decided Ellen. She was interrupted from her thoughts about renting an apartment by a phone call. "Hi, why haven't you called?" Grace's friend asked. "Hello, Grace. I've been fighting with my mom and I haven't had time to call. I didn't want to ruin your mood with my problems. That's my life right now. I could hang myself. My mom's been doing so much, I've decided to get my own place. I can't take it anymore." "You should have gotten away from her a long time ago," Grace said. "Maybe you could have had a baby and gotten married. You made the right decision, Ellen. Otherwise, you'll be a servant to your mother for the rest of her life. And your mommy's temper might make you lonely faster. Selfish women like her live a long time. You need help finding an apartment? No, I don't. I'm good. How's the baby making going? It's not going anywhere. I tried to meet a couple friends for that. Yeah, I didn't have the guts. Couldn't connect with the guys. When I think about it, no, it's not for me. I see, Grace said. Listen, Ellen, why don't you try IVF? You can get embryos implanted and there's no need to look for them. Not that, Grace. What if all the embryos survive and I have to choose which one to keep? No and no. And then I want to go through all the stages of motherhood from beginning to end, Ellen said. I want to see the eyes of the father of my child. Why do you want to see his eyes? Grace was surprised. As far as I know, the baby needs another organ to conceive. Maybe you won't understand me, but in his eyes I want to see what kind of man he is. The father of my child should at least be kind. Ellen, you'll never get pregnant for the rest of your life. And then why do you need his kindness if you're going to raise a child without his input? Then I can't explain. I can't yet, Ellen answered. Not until I take the job, I suppose. You're not pregnant? Grace asked. I have a plan. My doggie's birthday is next Thursday, but the party's on Saturday. So I'll tell Timmy to invite a couple or 3 kind-eyed men, preferably single, so that you won't be bored and lonely. How does that sound? That's a great idea. Why single men? I don't think that's really relevant here. You're not going to get married, and you're not going to hold men responsible. Not married ones, or married ones might scratch your eyes out and you wouldn't be able to see the goodness in the eyes of the one you choose, Grace laughed. I guess you're right, friend. Ellen laughed. That's why I love you. Grace, you can get a man out of any situation. At least I can laugh with you, because I've forgotten how to do it with my mother. Okay, no need to thank me, Grace said. I'm thinking we should make up a cover story. In case they ask why you're limping, there's got to be a mystery to your limp. You know how men love a mystery in a woman. No, I don't. I wasn't a mystery woman, Ellen replied. Let's stick to one legend, so we don't get confused. Well, let's say you were traveling with your fiancé in your car before the wedding, and some drunk made a collision of his Jeep with your car, suggested Grace. Your fiancé died on the spot, and you got a leg injury. You loved your fiancé so much that you never remarried. Imagine, every man would want such a mysterious, loyal woman. How's that for a story? A bloodier scenario, Ellen laughed. Well, if it helps, I agree. Just don't tell everyone this legend before the time, but only when absolutely necessary. Maybe we can do without legends. Done. Waiting for a special invitation to the party. Faithful bride Grace laughed. Bye, see you soon. Ellen was preparing thoroughly for Timmy's celebration. If she missed this chance, there would be no others. She bought a fancy new dress and shoes, even though she was going to hide her feet under the table. She made an appointment at the salon for a haircut and manicure. And all that preparation didn't escape Lexi's scrutinizing gaze. Going hunting, honey, Lexi said Friday. Make sure you don't miss. She didn't recognize her daughter Ellen had never been so meticulous about her appearance. And that was a bad sign for Lexi. Ellen remained silent at her mother's words. Then, to keep Lexi's mind occupied, she said, "Just so you don't get so annoyed, Mom, I'm moving out on Sunday. It's about time we got our own place." Lexi's eyes darted around. Her mouth opened and closed, but she couldn't get a word out. "Just drink some water and calm down," Ellen said. "And let's not get into this. It's irrevocably settled." Lexi took a sip of water and sat back in her chair. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. The grooming had evaporated somewhere, and almost 60 years read on her face. In that moment, Ellen felt unbearably sorry for her mother. but she realized that if she gave in to pity, her hell with her mother would continue. Ellen, like her friend, arrived at Timmy's birthday party early. She congratulated the birthday boy, helped Grace set the table, and sat down at that table, hiding her feet in her new shoes and her gait underneath. But only temporarily. After all, you can't hide a flaw like that. As soon as she got up from the table and walked, everyone would see her limping, leaning on her left foot, and no fancy dress or pretty shoes will help her. But there was still hope for a positive result in Ellen's soul. Her cheeks were flaming with excitement, her freckles gave her face a childlike innocence, and her long red hair was scattered over her shoulders. Helene's hair was always like that when she was excited. It was out of place. "She's good," Grace said. "If I were a man, I'd love you right here on this table." Ellen blushed even more. What do men look at? They look at their feet, and I'm not in the best shape. Forget about your legs tonight. Relax and attract men. You've got what it takes. Don't worry, I'm here for you. I got your back, girl. At Timmy's birthday party, there were 3 couples and 2 strange men. Ellen noticed one of them right away. He was the one she should favor. Greg the man introduced himself as a handsome man who looked like a catcher. "And for you, just Gosha." He smiled with all his magnificent teeth. He obviously knew that the ladies loved his smile. For the father of my child, he's suitable, Ellen thought. Handsome. Which means the baby will be handsome too. There's bravado and brazenness in his eyes, confidence in his irresistibility, but no anger. Let's see what happens next. Looks like they don't miss a single skirt. I hope he doesn't miss mine. The other was a little worried and clearly had some complexes, but his face was pleasant. He smiled at Ellen and introduced himself. Vincent. Vincent wanted to say something else, but Greg beat him to it. "And you, Helene?" Yes, Helene smiled. "Helene is as beautiful as a fairy tale," Greg said, and sat down at the table next to her. "Not only beautiful," said Grace, "but also wise." Ellen didn't like this presentation because everyone at the table was staring at her, and she was even more embarrassed and nervous. But then the toast to the birthday boy's health began, and Ellen slowly began to calm down. Greg was wooing her, talking and talking, clearly flirting with Ellen. He had her on the hook, and Ellen thought, just so long as he didn't snap. She flirted with Greg as best she could, and on Grace's recommendation, when she approached him, she tried to touch his hand. Across from Ellen and Greg sat Vincent. He glanced furtively at her and blushed, whether from the liquor he'd drunk or for some other reason. Vincent didn't speak to Helen the Beautiful. Greg didn't give him a chance. But when the dance began, Vincent jumped up and held out his hand to Helen. "May I invite you?" "No." "No," Helene replied fearfully. "I don't dance." Vincent remained standing in front of her with his hand outstretched. Helene was embarrassed that she had partially confessed her flaw. "I'm sorry, Vincent, my leg hurts, so I'm not dancing." It was only now that she saw the man's eyes. They were full of hope that had turned to despair. He said confusedly, "It's you, Helen. I apologize. I had the audacity to hope to dance with you." He sat down at the table, poured himself a full shot of vodka, and made a toast to the birthday boy. "To you, Timmy, to be loved and to be loved, and that it be mutual. Otherwise, it's all for nothing." Everyone supported Vincent, applauded his toast, and continued the party. Vincent got up from the table and never returned to it. He must have gone English, Ellen thought. Somehow she felt guilty that he had left. Well then, that's it. There's no one to choose from now. Greg is the only one. And he's persistent in his courtship and has already volunteered to walk Ellen out. And that's what she wants, Today he'll see her off, and tomorrow she'll move into a rented apartment, and under the pretext of helping her, she'll invite him to visit. And then she won't have to think about it. Greg had already made up his mind for her. All evening Ellen did not leave the table. She wanted to go to the toilet, but she was patient, afraid to scare Greg. But she had to get up, and she remembered that she had told Vincent that her leg hurt, and now she could limp under that pretext. "Sprained my leg," Helen said, as if to justify herself to Greg as they got out to get into a cab. "A sprain. Now I'm a limp leg." She laughed, and Greg laughed too, and then he picked Ellen up in his arms and kissed her on the lips and said, "What am I to do? Carry you in my arms, my Ellen the beautiful." It took Lexi a long time to fall asleep. Such attention to her appearance Ellen had never paid before. She must have had a man on her horizon and decided to have a baby. Lexi can't resist her daughter's desire to have a baby. If her daughter moves out on her, it's over. Ellen will be out of her control forever, and the money will be gone too. And what will she be able to afford in retirement? Nothing. And if her daughter stays with her, she'll have to pay the utilities and buy groceries. She's not going to take a bite out of her mom's mouth, and Lexi would save her pension for a vacation. She didn't see any other way out. She had to stop her daughter from leaving her. Tomorrow, Lexi decided I would cry and beg her to stay with me. I'll push pity, Lexi thought, and Ellen, the pitying one, will cool down. She wouldn't be so adamant. So far, Lexi had managed to manipulate her daughter, so she didn't give up hope. Sleep wouldn't come with the worry that she could lose everything. Absolutely everything she could afford. Her throat was already dry. She went to the kitchen for a drink of water. The window was open, and she heard a car pull up to the driveway. Lexi looked out and saw it was a cab with a man jumping out of it. He walked around the car, opened the back door, gave someone a hand, and Ellen stepped out of the car. The man put his arm around Ellen and pulled her to him. What was moving Lexi? She quickly threw on a robe, sprinting out to the entryway. The man was kissing Ellen. She was hugging him. "Oh, Lexi," the young man exclaimed when he saw her. Ellen and he flinched and recoiled from each other. The young man stepped closer. "Lexi," he said, "I hope you have serious intentions for my lame daughter, or are you just trying to make fun of her?" Ellen's face flashed as if she'd been doused with boiling water. Greg didn't know what to say. "I don't know what your intentions are," Lexi continued. "Ellen's intentions are that she doesn't care who she has a baby with. She doesn't know what she's doing. Age, you know, is driving her. She decided to have it for herself. But it is not certain that in the future she will not hold you responsible, if you, of course, fall for her tricks." Ellen was ready to fall to the ground at her mother's words. She, presented with humiliation, said nothing and went to the front door of the driveway. Her mother stayed with Greg and said something to him, but Ellen couldn't hear anything and didn't want to. Such shame she had never felt before. "Run, run," the thought pounded in her head. "Run wherever I am, or she will drive me to I don't know what." While Ellen was getting dressed, Lexi came back from the street. "How could you embarrass me like that?" Ellen asked quietly, almost in a whisper. There was a lump in her throat that prevented her from not only speaking, but even breathing. "A daughter." Lexi suddenly burst into tears. "Maybe I'm not so right, but I don't want you to get hurt later. The world of men is so cruel." Lexi rushed to hug her daughter, but Ellen pushed her away. "Get your hands off me," she said. "Don't come near me. I'm so tired of you." With these words, Helene went to the bathroom, turned on the water so she wouldn't hear her mother's wailing, and, as always, asked her reflection in the mirror, "Well, are you happy that you found a contender for the baby's father? It was your last chance to realize your dream after all." She grabbed a heavy glass soap dish and threw it at the mirror. The mirror shattered and the shards sprinkled at Ellen's feet. She picked up one shard and brought it to her hand where the blue wreath pulsed. Now interrupt that mole, too. There will be nothing, no limp leg, no pain, no shame. And there would be no baby. Someone was breaking at the door, shouting something, but Ellen didn't hear. Thoughts of the baby stopped her for a second. Nausea came to her throat, and she leaned over the sink. She threw up. She gripped the mirror shard so tightly she hurt her hand. Blood dripped into the sink. Her thoughts blurred, but thoughts of her baby kept her from following through. Her baby, who was in her thoughts, was now saving her. And Ellen suddenly realized that he was saving her so she could give him life. My baby, she whispered. Tears rolled down her cheeks and hail. The tension eased. She opened the door and stepped out. The horror. Lexi gasped. Who's going to buy a mirror now? No one, Ellen replied. Here's what happened next. Ellen went to her room and propped the door open with a bulky chair to keep her mother out. She had been packing since morning. By 9 o'clock a cab was to arrive, and that was it. Goodbye to the past life. Hello, new one, Ellen thought. For a fee, the cab driver helped her carry her things into the rented apartment. Then Katya called. Well, tell me about it. She poured questions. Did the bow fall for you like a boy? Even your legends did not need? How? His eyes are kind or not, laughed friend. Katya, I'm already in the new apartment I rented. Do you want to come to my place and celebrate the housewarming? I'll pick up a cake. Vasya, don't talk to me like that. I don't care about your cake. What I'm interested in is, did our plan work? Why aren't you talking? Vasya, are you crying? Did he hurt you? I'll be right over, send me the new address. An hour later, Katya showed up on the doorstep with a bottle of cognac and started praising Greg without any preamble. What a freak. You can't say that. Now we'll treat your stress. And she put the bottle on the glass coffee table. Do you have glasses for this drink in the house? I don't know yet. We'll see, Ellen answered. Katya stirred up the cognac. And you need a double dose, she decided. Men's offenses are cured only with a double dose of cognac. Can you believe me? I've taken a lot of shit from men. Oh, I've got a lemon in my bag and a chocolate bar, a noble snack for cognac. Soon they were getting tipsy, and it was getting easier. Drinking cognac, taking it as a medicine for the soul. Ellen told Catherine how her mother had embarrassed her in front of Greg. Wow. Stretched Katya. Why do you put up with it, Vasya? Immediately expel yourself from your mother. Do you realize what she's driven you to? To suicide? Come on, let's have another round. It's a stress reliever. Okay, men, to hell with them. But your own mother doing this to you. It's unbelievable. I'm already drunk, Helene laughed. Helene was already smiling. The medicine is working. Let's have another drink, Grace suggested. That's enough. Just eat your appetizer. Why did Ellen obey Grace? She didn't know, but the cognac made her feel better. You see, Grace, it was my last chance, she sighed. What am I supposed to do now? What you need to do now is calm down, get some rest, clean yourself up. I'll figure something out. I'll check things out with Stas. Maybe Greg isn't such a hopeless case. Maybe everything can be fixed. I tried to encourage my friend. We can still fight. I'm not a village, Ellen muttered sullenly. You didn't sleep last night, did you? Grace asked. Not much. Well, that's fine. There's a warm bed here with fresh linen. Get some sleep now. I'll call you tonight. I've got to go home now, or Timmy's going to give me a hard time. Then I'll have to be treated. Grace laughed and walked out. Ellen woke up around 4 in the evening. Strangely enough, there was no sign of a hangover. She felt rested and alert. She hadn't had time to clean up since this morning, so she started it now. Tomorrow was work. The weekend was over. Ellen realized she was content not to see or talk to her mother. She remembered that when Grace left, she'd put her phone on silent. As soon as she turned it on, it rang. Mom popped up on the screen. So many calls from her mother during the day that Ellen didn't even bother counting them. She pressed disconnect and blocked her mother from the phone. Not now, Ellen thought. I can't even hear her voice. Late that night, Grace called. How are you doing? Are you back to normal? Did you get a nice apartment? Is it cozy? I'm here, Ellen said. I'm all cleaned up. I'm just sitting here enjoying the solitude. I've blocked my mom and somehow I don't feel guilty. Good for you. Take a break from each other and keep your toxic mom at a distance. Grace continued. Well, I'll tell you what, Ellen. Don't you relax at all. Get yourself some fancy clothes for your closet. Get some masks, some creams. Take care of yourself. You and I are on the path to cloudless love. We'll figure out what to do next. We women are the kind of people who don't just give up. You'll have a child, I'm telling you. I won't be me if we don't find you a man with kind eyes. Any other wishes, Helena the Beautiful? Grace laughed. No more, laughed Helen, except to come with me to the store and help me choose a closet. That would be my pleasure. I love shopping, even if it's not for myself. So, Ellen, are you ready to go to the beauty ball? Well, what ball? Ellen was surprised. Grace, couldn't you think of something more appropriate for me? What kind of ball would I go to with my legs? Wait, have you seen the movie Cinderella? What does that have to do with it? It does. So when I'm in a bad mood or depressed, I watch this fairy tale. By the way, I recommend it for self-esteem. It's exactly what all women should watch. I don't get it, Ellen said, confused. But look, Cinderella there all the time doing something, cooking. In short, working like a slave in the galleys. And her stepmother gives her so many tasks that she can't even go and look at the ball of her dreams from afar. What does her godmother tell her? Grace asked. What does she say? Well, she says it's very hurtful not to go to the prom, especially when you deserve it. And I realize I'm the Cinderella who works hard for her family. And it's bad for me not to go to the ball because I deserve it. And I'm going to the ball. I've never noticed that about you, Ellen said doubtfully. Grace continued. Do you go to discos? No, my children already go to discos. And my ball is shopping or beauty salon. Those are my balls. That's where I feel like a princess, not a dirty Cinderella. Long story short, I'll meet you at 6 p.m. outside the Merriam Mall. We're going to make a princess out of you. You ready? I'm ready, replied Ellen. Ellen and Grace walked around the mall from one store to another, and as they shopped, their mood improved. Satisfied with their purchases, they went to a cafe in the same center for coffee and sweets. I didn't want to upset you right away, and I'm not going to tell you exactly what Timmy and Greg said, Grace began, sipping her coffee. It's not going to work. It's a hopeless case. Your mother's done her best. Ellen, don't be discouraged. If it's a holiday on your street, it'll be a holiday on your street. I'm not despairing, Helen said. Even if Greg wanted to meet me, I do not know how I would look in his eyes. So Grace, relax. Relax. We're at a ball. The next night after going to the mall, Grace called. Here's the thing, Ellen. She began excitedly. She could hear that she was excited and eager to share the news. Hello to you too. Hello, Helene replied calmly. Oh, hello. There's such news. Grace continued. Tell me at once, are you standing or sitting? And without waiting for an answer, she began her fiery speech. If you're standing, you better sit down or you're going to fall, girl. What else is there? Helene couldn't take it anymore. Speak already. Stop pouring water. You know who came to see me at work today? Grace, just tell me. What am I supposed to do with this riddle? Vincent came by, and he came for you. Ellen had a picture of Vincent standing in front of her with his hand out. What do you mean, for my sake? She asked, perplexed. That's what it might look like after editing. And the fact that he asked for your phone number means you shouldn't ignore strange calls, Grace continued. I don't know if he'll have the guts to call you tonight. He seems confused, probably shy or insecure. Well, just like you. I didn't want to give him your number at first. I thought I'd get it from you. Whether I could or not, he insisted, Grace said. I don't get it now, Ellen said. You just said he was shy or insecure, and suddenly he was pushing you. And he said to me as soon as I saw Ellen, I knew she was my woman. Please, Grace, help me. I have a lot to say to her, that's how he put it. Is it possible to say things like that? Ellen's cheeks flared as if she'd gotten too close to the flames. Her heart raced with excitement. Could a man really like her? And not just for one night. She didn't believe it, but she wanted to believe it. Why don't you say something, Helene? Or don't you like his eyes? Grace asked. Grace, I'm so confused right now, Ellen smiled to herself. His eyes are kind but sad. Can anyone really like me? You both have kind but sad eyes. Maybe that's why you need each other. Grace said thoughtfully. Listen to me, Ellen. He doesn't just like you. Do you hear me, Ellen? He said he's sure you're his woman. And that's a lot more than just liking you. Are you happy? I don't know yet, Helene answered. Don't scare this male away. At least use him as a donor. Does he know I have a limp? Helene suddenly realized. I'm sorry, friend, but I told him our legend, and I think he liked it. And he's not going to give up on you. On the contrary, he's even more interested in you. Ellen, I'll tell you something else. He knows what your mom told Greg. And you know what he said? That he's willing to grant you your wish, and he wants to take responsibility because he wants a baby too. This is what it might look like when it's edited. That's awful, Ellen said. How embarrassing. It's nothing to be ashamed of, said Grace confidently. He is ready to love you with all your faults and peculiarities. Love is out of the question now, said Ellen. How stupid you are, Helen. And I read you the wisdom. And this is the real love, without any conventions. When you're loved not for something, but against all odds. Of course, such love is rare, but I think you deserve it.
That's it. No more arguments. Wait for the call, Grace said firmly.
That's Grace. Neither hello nor goodbye, Ellen thought. But I'm so grateful to fate for my only friend. They'd been friends since they were students. Ellen, with her complexes, somehow fenced off friendships with her classmates, but Grace, with her assertiveness, was impossible to fence off. And Ellen was grateful for that. Vincent didn't call that day or the next. Helene had thought he'd analyzed everything after his conversation with Grace and decided not to contact her. But she was wrong. He did call. Ellen, hello. It's Vincent. You probably don't remember me, do you? Hello, Vincent. I remember you. I'm sorry I didn't get to dance with you. I have a leg. Don't make excuses, I know. It doesn't matter. I want to see you and have a lot to say to you. That's what matters. Do you want to come to my place? Ellen has the courage to offer. And we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. And I wanted to ask you out. I'm tired, Helene admitted. She didn't want to beat around the bush. She wanted a baby. And then it's up to her. I'm tired too. A lot of work. So I'm coming to you, Vincent decided. Sure. I'll drop you the address, Helen agreed. Are the flowers for me?" she asked hesitantly, clutching a bouquet of fragrant white peonies to her chest. "I'll give them to you often," Vincent promised. "This is what it might look like after editing. If you let me, I will. Come in. Vincent, do you want tea?" "I will. I have a lot to tell you, Ellen." "I've been thinking for a long time, so don't interrupt me," Vincent asked. "All right, if you say so," Helene agreed. "I know you want a baby, and I want it just as much as you do, so I'm ready." "Oh, that's not what I'm saying. Anyway, I want us to be together. And the baby is secondary." "No, of course. And the baby is secondary." "Well, I'm confused now," Vincent said, blushing. "Anyway, as soon as I saw you, I knew I wanted to live with you and grow old with you." "Is that a declaration of love or a marriage proposal?" "Really?" Ellen asked. "It's both an explanation and a proposal," Vincent replied. "But we don't really know each other," said Helene. "We have our whole lives ahead of us. We'll find out. It was only when I saw you that I thought I had known you for a long time." "Let's not be in a hurry," Ellen asked. "I mean with marriage." "And the baby?" Vincent asked. "With the baby, we have to hurry," Helene said in a businesslike manner. She came very close to Vincent and looked into his eyes and remarked, "Good eyes." She wished her child had such eyes. Vincent put his arms around her and whispered softly in her ear so that no one would hear. My Helen the beautiful." And then the love of two adults turned into a passion that consumed both Helen and Vincent and carried their bodies into the world where the sacrament of the child's conception begins. "Vincent! Vincent!" Helene shouted to her husband, who was standing under the windows of the hospital. "Look, it's our son." Tears of happiness and love for the baby and her husband flowed down her cheeks. "Vincent, he has eyes like yours. Can you hear me? And his hair is red like mine." "I can hear you," Vincent smiled. "I'll hear you always and everywhere." My Helen the beautiful. Grace heard a familiar voice behind her. "Grace, it's so good to see you." Lexi rushed over to Grace with a hug and even wept. Something Ellen's mom had never been sentimental about, and she'd always looked down on Grace. And now this. "Wondrous are thy works, O Lord." Grace thought about the change in Lexi. "I can't believe I had to go to this meeting," she lamented. "Hello, Lexi. How did you end up in this neighborhood?" Grace didn't know what to talk to Lexi about and realized the stupidity of the question. "It was Pete's birthday. I decided to come to this mall and buy him a present. There are so many different departments, I'll find something interesting," Lexi replied. "Pete. What's this new character I'm hearing about for the first time?" Grace thought, but didn't dare ask. She wanted to get away from Lexi as soon as possible, knowing that she would start pestering her with questions about Ellen. "Grace, I'm inviting you to the cafe here on the first floor. I'm so happy to see you. I just want to sit with you and drink coffee and talk about this and that," Lexi persisted. That's exactly what Grace didn't want. "But I'm in a hurry. I just ran in here for a minute. And my son, remember, he picked out his sneakers, put them aside. So I came by to buy them back." "I won't keep you long," Grace began to justify herself. "Don't you have 20 or 30 minutes for your friend's mom?" Lexi asked in a very pathetic tone. "Okay, half an hour," I guess Grace gave in. They drank coffee and cakes, and Grace looked at Lexi and thought, yeah, it's a little less glamorous. Ellen's lack of money has taken a toll on her mom's looks. "How is Ellen doing?" Lexi finally asked, staring at Grace. "She's doing well," she said shortly. "It's a dream come true," Lexi said cryptically. It has Lexi continued. Ellen's son is so cute and funny. And then Grace burst into tears. A redhead like Ellen. I love him. And his name is Alex. She named him after her father who left her. Grace didn't know what to say to Lexi. She's been living in apartments with the baby, Lexi continued. It's like I'm her enemy and she doesn't have a home. No, not us. She got married and her husband has a 2-bedroom apartment. Lexi went completely numb from the shock. She leaned over to her cup of coffee and drank it in one fell swoop like water. It was obvious from everything that Grace had shocked her with this news. Divorced and delinquent on child support, Ellen's hubby. Lexi asked angrily. He's probably sucking on her like a leech and sucking money out of her. There's plenty of men like that around. Yeah, you were a leech, Grace thought. There's a lot of them out there. He's divorced, but he's not in arrears. And he's got a good paying job. Ellen's a rock. Grace smiled. I'm so happy for her. You've added fuel to the fire, Grace thought. Lexi suddenly burst into tears, almost to the point of tears. She left her old mom and she's living in chocolate and doesn't even think about me. Maybe I'm starving. Maybe I need medicine. Maybe I'm not alive anymore. She wailed. Something doesn't fit with Lexi being in as much distress as she describes, Grace thought. She came to an expensive mall to get a gift and invited me to a coffee shop. Don't cry, Lexi, you should be happy that Ellen is doing well, Grace reassured her. And is she? Lexi persisted. How does she live with not talking to her mother and Grace? Grace wanted to tell her that everything was fine without her. But she didn't dare. You never know what Lexi's going to say when she hears that. Married me, huh? You had to get married, Lexi said in a high-pitched tone. And at my age, why should I? Congratulations. Grace was genuinely surprised. It's wonderful. You're not alone. You have support, Grace said. God forbid I have support, Lexi said. But I didn't have a choice. I had to get married. I guess you could say Ellen pushed me into it. Is he a bad man? Alcoholic, greedy? Hurt you? Grace was now curious about Lexi's husband. He's ex-military, retired colonel. But as you know, there's no such thing as ex-military. No, he's not a drunk. He's not greedy. His pension is good. We live at my place. We also rent his apartment. It's okay. But I live like I'm in the army, Grace. Anything goes wrong, all I hear is, stand down, round and round. Grace could barely contain her laughter. That's exactly the kind of husband Lexi needed to put the brakes on her hubris and selfishness. He's used to being in charge. Now he's got me under his command. Lexi kept complaining. He's nagging me about not talking to Ellen. And it's not easy for me to be in a quarrel with Ellen. My son and grandchildren come to see me, but my daughter doesn't. Grace, I beg you, please help us to reconcile with Helen. Then at least Vincent won't nag me about it, Lexi asked. Nothing has changed, Grace thought. Even now, Lexi's not thinking about her daughter and grandchild, but about making sure Vincent doesn't nag her for fighting with her daughter. Tell her to call me and I'll be waiting. Help me, Grace. I'll try, but I can't promise anything. I'm afraid you've pushed her too far away from you. We have to take the first steps toward each other. And I'm ready. I just don't have her contacts. Otherwise, Vincent would have dragged me to Helen, Grace said. Vincent was intriguing her more and more. She couldn't resist asking. How did you meet your husband? At the resort. I've been seeing him for 6 years. He's a widower and kept trying to marry me. But I kept putting it off, Lexi explained. I knew a man was a lot of work, Grace snickered. And you're not used to hard work. All right, well, it was good to see you, she changed her tone. I'll tell Ellen I saw you and that you're waiting for her call. Goodbye, Lexi." "I'll be waiting," Lexi shouted after her. "Well, Ellen, we should call Mom," Grace pondered. "She's going to be waiting, no matter what." "I'm afraid," Ellen admitted. "I'm afraid she might ruin what I have now. I feel sorry for her, and I have often thought of reconciliation. And Vincent says you can't choose your mothers, you have to reconcile. But every time I think of what she's done to me, I don't want to take that step." "Don't be afraid," Helene, Vincent said. "She won't destroy what we have between us. But you'll feel better if you make peace with your mother." "At peace?" Helene asked doubtfully. "By all means. A bad peace is better than a good quarrel. And then there's Commander-in-Chief Pete. I don't know what his middle name is, but he keeps Lexi's battles going." Grace laughed. "Hello, Mom," Ellen called Lexi. "Daughter, it's so good to hear from you," came Lexi's voice. Pete sat next to her and nodded his head in satisfaction. Lexi looked at her husband with a sidelong glance. She wanted so badly to express her grievances, but with Pete around, the chances were nil. "Daughter, I'm so excited to see you, to meet your husband, to hold Alex in my arms. If you knew how much I miss you. You know I got married too, right? You should meet Pete. He's a wonderful man." "No more eulogies," Pete said loudly. Ellen heard his commanding voice and smiled. Finally, someone can control Mom's temper. "Daughter, Pete and I are expecting you on Sunday. Will you come?" Lexi asked. No more questions. Pete's voice came again. "Yes, I'll talk to Vincent," Ellen answered. "Hello, Ellen. I'm Pete, a retired colonel and Lexi's husband. Lexi and I are expecting on Sunday. No refusal is accepted," Pete Kondratievich said confidently. "Okay, Vincent?" "We'll come. We'll definitely come," Vincent smiled, seeing how Pete had the situation under control. "We'll be waiting. Goodbye." Pete said goodbye and handed the phone to Lexi. "I'm so glad, my daughter." Tears of joy rolled down Lexi's cheeks. "See you later." She pressed disconnect. "No more tears," Pete said, smiling. "They ruin a girl's beauty." He hugged Lexi convincingly. She rested her head on his shoulder, and in that moment was grateful for her husband's support. "We need to get groceries for the table," Lexi said, coming to her senses. "We'll go tomorrow. We'll get everything," Pete nodded. "Are you okay? I see your face is red. Let's take your blood pressure, or we won't have guests coming to our house but to your hospital." Pete kept a close eye on his wife's condition, concerned for her health. His determination and concern helped Lexi keep the situation under control. The husband and his mistress were already rubbing their hands together, but they had no idea how their wife would teach them a lesson. Kira, as long as she could remember, had always dreamed of warmth, care, and attention. All this she lacked since early childhood. Kira's mom died of a heart attack when the girl was about 5 years old. Doctors warned Adelaide about the risks, but the woman still decided to give birth. For the first few years of her life, Kira was the most loved child in the world. She vaguely remembered those times: warm hugs, her mother's gentle words, and kind smiles. But of course, Kira couldn't remember the details. Mom's face was lost in the fog. The meaning of her phrases slipped away. Then Kira was left alone with her father, a sullen and taciturn man. He fulfilled his parental duties faithfully, fed his daughter, bought her clothes, even checked her lessons. But any heart-to-heart talks were out of the question. Her father asked only specific questions about her grades at school, her health, her plans for vacations. Sometimes he wondered if someone was hurting his daughter. That was all. Kira didn't know. couldn't remember if Dad had always been so unsociable, or if he had been so changed by the death of his beloved woman. From neighbors, Kira had heard more than once that her father loved her mother very much, long sought the favor of a modest beauty, and then, when Elsa married him, fulfilled her every wish. Kira was hard to imagine her eternally dissatisfied with something father so romantic, in love, attentive. Becoming older, the girl understood the father blames his daughter for the death of her spouse, accidentally overhearing his conversation with a neighbor. The men were standing in the stairwell and Kira was just returning from school. The anniversary of Mom's passing was approaching. That's probably why the neighbors, longtime pals, had struck up this conversation. "I told her to get an abortion," Dad said quietly. "And she wouldn't have it. Let it be," she said. She had a feeling it would end well. Kira, hearing these words, froze under the stairs. She just couldn't go up now and make her presence known. "Well, that's how it ended up being okay at first," Uncle Vince, the neighbor, pointed out. Kira knew her mom was friends with his wife and Aunt Elsa. Kira was born. Adelaide still had a whole 5 years to live afterward. "That's so sad," Dad agreed. But her health deteriorated. I could see it right away. She got worse. And then there were those sleepless nights. You know, I tried to get up myself to see my daughter so Adelaide could rest, but I couldn't be there all the time. Those bastards. They finished her off after 5 years. That's for sure. Even the doctor confirmed it. Kira took it hard. She hadn't discussed it with anyone. And who would she tell? Her father, as it turned out, considers her the culprit of all his misfortunes. That's why he probably doesn't talk to his daughter much. Kira didn't have any grandmothers. Or rather, there was one Dad's mom, but she lived far away in the village. They saw each other very rarely, and of course warm, trusting relations between them did not arise. And girlfriends. What about girlfriends? You can't talk to them about such topics, they won't understand. They're just fine. Everyone has a mom and a dad. Not everyone has a mom and a dad. But mom's the main one. How many tears were shed into the pillow in her childhood, teenage years, longing for a mother the girl hardly knew or remembered. Sadness over the cool and strained relationship with her father. Kira dreamed of growing up sooner, having a family of her own, having children. She had no doubt that sooner or later a man would appear in her life who would love and protect her. And Kira would become happiness for him, a source of energy and inspiration. Her father probably loved her in his own way, took care of his daughter as best he could, worried about her future. It was her father who arranged for the girl to go to the University of Economics and Law, and even to the prestigious Faculty of Finance and Economics, and made some connections. And now his daughter, who would hardly have entered on general grounds, is a student of the best university in the city. No, Kira was not stupid or lazy. She always studied well at school and diligently did her homework. But just to enter this faculty required quite outstanding abilities. The girl didn't have them, so her father helped her. True, among Kira's classmates, as it soon turned out, outstanding abilities possessed few. So many then got into the university in this way either for money or by blat. Kira liked studying, and with classmates somehow immediately formed a warm, friendly relationship. A wonderful student time began. Life had changed a lot. Kira felt that very soon she would become an adult and independent. That means that her dream of a loving family is very close. In the 4th year, fate dealt the girl another crushing blow. She was left all alone, her father frowning and taciturn, but so reliable, died. In the shop where he was working, a gas cylinder malfunctioned and a fire broke out. There were few victims, but Kira's father was among them. Only left alone in the whole world, Kira realized that all this time felt the support and love of a loved one. Yes, her father was like that. He couldn't express his feelings, didn't speak much, but now Kira realized how much he did for her. About a year the girl came to herself. getting used to the new world without her father. And then Andrew came into her life. Andrew was a student of their university, but he studied at a different faculty at the law school. That year he, like Kira, was finishing his studies. They met at a common lecture for soon-to-be graduates, which was held in the auditorium. The young people were told about the very procedure of graduation, state exams and diploma, familiarized young people with possible employers, presented companies that offered jobs to the best and most diligent students. It was interesting. Kira happened to be among strangers. Her friends were sitting at the other end of the hall. But Kira was a little late, and there was no place next to them. Therefore, Kira had to settle down where there were still empty chairs. At first, all the girl's attention was focused on the stage. She caught every word of the speakers, even wrote something down. Kind of boring and unexpected question caught the girl off guard. She turned around to the speaker. A handsome guy was looking at her with a smile. A wide, white-toothed smile, correct facial features, and bright blue eyes immediately charmed Kira. There was such interest in them. The girl suddenly felt that she was not indifferent to this man. "It's deadly dreary," repeated the young man. "And the weather outside is so wonderful. Spring is in full swing. There's a festival of spring flowers in the park, by the way. Why don't we run away?" It was the first time Kira had seen this guy. Besides, the lecture was very important and interesting. And after it, Kira and her friends agreed to go to the library to prepare together for the test. But all this somehow suddenly lost importance, and the girl nodded in agreement. The guy glowed, as if her answer made him the happiest person ever. He confidently took Kira's hand and led her away from the classroom. The weather really turned out to be wonderful. The sun was shining brightly from a clear, soft blue sky, and the newly blossomed greenery was fresh and clean. The air was filled with the aromas of plants that were beginning to bloom. On the way, the young people got acquainted. It turned out that the guy's name was Andrew. He admitted that as soon as he saw Kira, immediately could not take his eyes off her. "You're just an incredible beauty," he said, looking at the girl. And the one, strangely enough, did not feel a shadow of embarrassment, although always distinguished by modesty. I looked at you. I dared to speak for a long time. I was so afraid you would send me away. When you agreed to leave with me, I had a mountain off my shoulders," Andrew admitted. Kira was pleased to hear those words. She liked Andrew more and more. What if she had forbidden herself to even dream about him so that she wouldn't be disappointed? What if he was the man she would later start a family with? Yes, these thoughts visited Kira at the first acquaintance. They started dating. Andrew turned out to be a reliable, loving, sensitive man. Having learned the story of the girl, he took her under his wing. In everything, he tried to help Kira. The guy even helped her make repairs. More precisely, he did it himself, almost alone, because the girl did not understand anything about it at all. A little more time passed. Young people graduated from university, and both got a job. Kira became an accountant in a small firm for the installation of intercoms. Andrew went as an assistant judge in the local court. Kira knew by then that Andrew was growing up without a father. His mother had given birth to him at a rather late age, as they say, for herself. She was a powerful woman who had spent her entire life working in a management position at the airport. Even now, at her advanced age, she was reluctant to leave her position. Andrew kept trying to introduce Kira to her, but for some reason the girl was afraid. What if Andrew's mother didn't like her? What then, if this woman will be against the relationship of her only son with a poor commoner? Andrew laughed at these fears. Mom isn't like that. Yes, she's used to bossing around, but in everything that concerns me, she gives me freedom and autonomy. I've been on my own for 6 years. She's always worked hard, and I've stayed at home on the farm. So don't worry, I'm not a mama's boy, and she's not a monster. Still, Kira persistently made up excuses not to go to Andrew's mother's house. Worried, afraid of this meeting. And then Andrew proposed to Kira. It cannot be said that it was completely unexpected. Relationships of young people have long been strong, warm, very close. The way of life without each other they no longer imagined. The girl had no doubt that Andrew was exactly the person she had dreamed of since childhood. He gave her everything that Kira so lacked: love, attention, care, tenderness. With him it was possible to talk about any topic. A soulmate. A soulmate. Sometimes Kira couldn't believe her happiness. But all this might not have happened if she hadn't found herself that day at the lecture in the chair next to Andrew. Such a fateful accident. Andrew did everything beautifully, just like in the movies. Invited Kira to a restaurant to celebrate his small promotion. The girl did not even guess about the true motives of this date. Then suddenly musicians came up to them and played a beautiful melody. Kira, flapping her eyes in surprise, looked at the men in white tails. Then a waiter appeared with a luxurious bouquet of roses. Andrew took it from the hands of the young man and with a smile presented it to Kira, then deftly pulled out of his pocket a velvet box. "Be my wife," Andrew smiled, looking into Kira's eyes. "You are the most beautiful girl in the world. I love you and I really want to be by your side forever." The girl then even had tears flowing from her eyes, so moved was she. This proposal was made so beautifully. Andrew carefully prepared for the meeting, so much thought out. What was happening resembled a scene from a good, though not too original, melodrama. The young people began to prepare for the wedding. Both decided that they did not need a lavish celebration, just a party with friends from the university in a restaurant. And yet it was necessary to solve a lot of issues, to book a place in the registry office, to find a restaurant, to think over the menu. And of course now Kira had to meet Andrew's mom. There was no point in postponing the meeting any longer. Kira remembered the day she'd first seen Maggie. The girl had been terribly nervous, but the woman who opened the door seemed to be smiling at her quite genuinely. Tall, slender Maggie looked very stylish in her elegant dress, with her hair slicked back smoothly. A real lady, and she behaved in a very friendly and polite manner. True, Kira immediately realized that Andrew's mother belongs to the so-called cold type of women carrier, accustomed to work hard, compete, and achieve their own. From such a woman cannot wait for heartfelt conversations, warm hugs. You couldn't expect any worldly advice from her. Maggie will definitely not become a second mom. And in the role of a cozy grandmother, spoiling grandchildren with pies, it is also difficult to imagine her. But that's the small stuff. Maggie caused Kira respect and even admiration. You bet, because she achieved so much on her own, became a big boss and a wonderful son raised. All this alone, without the help of her husband or relatives. After the wedding, the young people began to live in Kira's apartment. Both worked. Andrew received a good salary. Enough even for some excesses: cafes and restaurants, beautiful clothes, concerts, and most importantly for traveling. For 2 years of marriage, Young managed to fly to the sea 5 times. Not to luxury resorts with 5-star hotels, but still it was a wonderful vacation. Fun, carefree, full of sun and warmth. Kira and Andrew together learned to lead a household. In principle, the young wife knew how to do everything because she had been living alone for a long time. But the head of the family had to master new skills. Although Andrew coped with it quickly and even as if playfully, Kira felt happier than ever. Nearby was a man who understood her half a word. Andrew listened with interest to Kira's news, accumulated during the day, in all situations took her side, and also often hugged his young wife on and off. Kira realized that she finally met the man she had dreamed of for so long, and mentally thanked fate for this chance encounter. And then the newlyweds had their first son, Max. The name was chosen by Andrew. That was the name of his neighbor, who paid a lot of attention to the boy and became for him a kind of replacement for his grandfather. This was a respected man, serious, intelligent. He headed the local factory for a long time. That would be our Max, as smart and responsible turned out, dreamed the young father, rocking his tiny son in his arms. Kira nodded her head. She had slightly different plans for this child. The young mother wanted Max to be happy and healthy, and the rest was not so important. You didn't have to be a factory manager at all to feel joyful and peaceful. Max really turned out to be a lively and incredibly curious kid. He was ahead of his peers in many ways. Early went, early spoke. The baby constantly asked his parents questions, was interested in the world around him, tried to understand literally everything. Newly baptized parents did not want a soul in the firstborn. And so when he was about 4 years old, they decided that it was time to give birth to Max's little sister. Kira hoped that she and Andrew would have a daughter. She wanted to give that little girl all the things she didn't have: pretty dresses, fancy hairdos at matinees, conversations about girlish secrets like hugs and kitchen chores and such. But Vince was born a wonderful blue-eyed baby, charming in the first days of life, charismatic, attracting the attention of others. Well, for a daughter then? Next time Andrew smiled, rocking the stroller. It was their first family stroll through the city. Max was holding onto the handle of the stroller too. He was so looking forward to his brother, so excited to see him. But when Vince was brought home from the hospital, he was a little disappointed. It turned out Max had hoped his brother would be older right away. He'd imagined a boy with whom he could play catch-up or hide and seek. Time flew by at a dizzying speed. It turned out that coping with a couple of little boys at once is not so easy. And then Maggie suddenly came to Kira's rescue. Every day after work, her mother-in-law hurried home, quickly changed her clothes, had dinner and went straight to her daughter-in-law. Andrew was often delayed in court, sometimes came only late at night. By evening, Kira was completely exhausted, and at this difficult period, Maggie appeared. To take care of the grandchildren, she would go out with the kids to walk in the yard. Sometimes they'd go farther, to the park. It was only 2-3 hours a day at the most. But how Kira waited for them every time. While the children were away, she had time to clean up, cook something, go to the bathroom. And all this in peace and quiet. It would seem a trifle, but for a young, tired mother, it was a real salvation. How grateful Kira was to Maggie. She repeatedly told her mother-in-law about it, and the latter smiled discreetly and replied that she herself was happy to communicate with her grandchildren. No, a warm and close relationship between daughter-in-law and mother-in-law never developed, although Kira wanted it very much. She invited Maggie to tea, tried to make frank conversations, but this woman was some too aloof, cold and inaccessible, like the Snow Queen. Either she had such a character, or she didn't like Kira very much after all. Eventually, Kira stopped worrying about it and accepted the situation as it was. Maggie did not interfere with her daughter-in-law with advice, reproaches, and moralizing. She appeared when Kira badly needed her, and helped the young mother a lot. Perhaps the woman herself did not even realize how she supported Kira in a difficult period. Some more time passed. The boys grew up. Now they both went to kindergarten, and Kira was finally able to go to work. There was more money in the family. The couple began to plan a summer trip to the sea. It was to be the first for their children. And then life in the country began to change. Enterprises were closing one after another. This fate befell the firm where Kira worked. The woman was out of work. Andrew's salary began to be delayed steadily, which, by the way, at the new price level was not enough even for the most basic necessities. Andrew was now practically never at home at all. After a working day in court, he ran around the city in search of part-time work, somewhere to guard a warehouse, somewhere to help unload a truck. The man grabbed every opportunity to bring an extra penny into the house. Kira was now at home. She was looking for a job in her specialty. She ran to interviews, gave ads in newspapers, but there were no results. As a result, the woman could not even find a job as a salesperson. The supply of jobs in their town at that time far exceeded the demand for them. Kira was glad that she had at least managed to find a job as a cleaner. Now she cleaned the entrances of the neighboring building in the early morning while everyone was still asleep. The pay was low, but the upside was that the job ended before noon, and the whole day was free. Money was scarce, the children were growing at a dizzying rate, and their clothes were quickly becoming too small for them. They also needed to eat a full meal. Andrew and Kira could sit on buckwheat or pasta, but the boys needed vitamins, meat, fruit, and milk. Young spouses were often close to despair. It was Maggie who kept them from being completely lost. She had long ago been cut down, as she was old enough to be on a well-deserved vacation. And just someone needed a warm place, which for a long time was occupied by a firm and principled boss. But for years of work at a fairly high post, Maggie managed to save a certain amount of money. She dreamed of buying a small house by the sea, where she expected to meet old age. But circumstances have changed, and prices have risen. Now the woman's savings would not be enough for a decent place to live, and she was not going to buy anything. So Maggie used her savings to sponsor a young family every month. Both Andrew and Kira knew that if anything happened, they wouldn't be lost. Maggie wouldn't let them go under. But at the same time, they both didn't want to abuse the woman's help, and so they tried, stretched as hard as they could. It was hard, and yet the feeling of a strong rear guard kept them from getting discouraged. Despite everything that was happening, Maggie still remained for Kira incomprehensible, almost a stranger. Her mother-in-law kept her distance from her daughter-in-law, and with her son she did not open up and did not hug. But with grandchildren, a different matter. Only next to them the woman blossomed. She unashamedly hugged, kissed, called affectionate nicknames. And the boys reciprocated her grandmother. Kira sometimes tried to talk about it with her husband. "Never mind," Andrew replied. "That's just the way she is." I will try to keep the text as close to the original as possible, without adding new sentences and paragraphs. The length of the text will be roughly maintained. Dialogues and direct speech I will highlight according to the rules of the Russian language. The text will be divided into paragraphs. Phraseologisms will be replaced by more modern or simple expressions. Punctuation marks will be inserted according to the rules of the Russian language. All names and city names will be replaced with American names written in Russian letters. Name substitutions will be made according to the suggested list or made up by yourself if the name is not on the list. Mom was always like that. He smiled. Just a person so kind, good, loving. But she doesn't know how to show her feelings. Maybe it's because Mom grew up in an orphanage, didn't get love as a child. So she doesn't know how to express her feelings. But she's reliable, and she doesn't abandon her own. When Andrew and Kira's sons went to school, Maggie took over the lessons. It turned out that she once, many years ago, wanted to become an elementary school teacher. Then the woman's career took a different path, but now the long-time dream was realized in her grandchildren. Grandmother enthusiastically practiced with the boys. She knew how to be strict and demanding, but at the same time she emphasized to interest Max and Vince, to instill in them the desire for knowledge, to develop the innate abilities of her grandchildren. While their parents were trying to make a few extra pennies and were out working, their children were not running around the yard as street kids. They were under the reliable supervision of their grandmother, who invested a lot in their development. The result was pleasing. Both Max and Vince were the best students in their classes. They also excelled in sports. Maggie had time to drive them to the volleyball club on the other side of town. In this sports center worked the best coach, and Maggie did not agree to anything less for her grandchildren. And so they lived, trying their best, supporting each other, raising their children. And then one day Andrew got tired of living, as the man himself put it, a miserable existence. He decided to risk opening his own business. It is clear that the money for the promotion of the businessman took from his mother. And where else? Not in the bank at a crazy interest rate to make loans. Andrew bought in a neighboring city from a warehouse small things, technical, sold on the market more expensive, and immediately received, albeit small, but a profit. Success inspired. Andrew decided to work in this direction and registered as an individual entrepreneur. Kira helped him with the documents. She was an economist. She worked as an accountant for a long time. So reporting and primary documentation were entirely on her. The couple rented a place in the market and started work. At first, the business was slow. The client base had not yet been built up. Links with suppliers had not been established. Profits in the first few months were either minimal or non-existent. I had to solve many different problems. Sometimes I even wanted to give up, but in the end the business went on, and the small store earned money. Finally, the family had some money, albeit small, but it was their own. They didn't have to ask Maggie for help anymore. Andrew had even managed to pay her back the money he had borrowed to develop the business. Kira knew that her mother-in-law tried to refuse, to give this help as a gift to the young family, but Andrew insisted they still flew to the sea. The boys were old enough to be truly impressed by everything. Kira watched with what joy they were running along the beach, and her heart sank with delight. What happiness this was. There was more to come. Andrew's business grew. Soon the man opened a whole store, then another. Now he had a whole staff working for him, accountants, managers, salespeople. But Kira was given the opportunity not to work and to deal with the house and children. True, the boys had already become teenagers and no longer needed babysitters. But the family moved to a private house, and Kira had a whole garden at her disposal. For its improvement, the woman took up with energy and inspiration. And again, she thanked fate for what is happening in her life. A house of full cup, a loving husband, wonderful, talented children. Every day a reason for joy and pride. And the garden, where Kira felt herself a full mistress. Here she felt calm, relaxed, peaceful. The woman believed that her present life was a reward for what she had to endure as a child. She also often regretted that her father did not see how wonderful life was for his daughter. Probably he would be happy for Kira, and certainly did not dote on his grandchildren. And yet, as time went on, Kira began to realize that something was missing. Andrew had grown distant. No, they still had a wonderful relationship. Her husband was never rude to her, always remembered holidays and their personal dates. Only he was too busy working. He came home late at night, traveled a lot, literally lived his life. Max and Vince are almost adults. They have their own lives, their own friends, their own interests. And that's fine. It's just a little sad that their sons have grown up so fast. And Kira hadn't had time to fully enjoy their childhood years. She'd been too busy surviving. Maggie remained alien and cold. Such a character. Kira probably didn't even know how or what to talk to her about until now. Their only topic of conversation was probably Vince and Max. Her mother-in-law was old, but she still looked like an iron lady. She refused to move into her son's house from her own apartment, where she'd been a full-fledged mistress. And Kira understood and supported her in this. And in this difficult period in the life of Kira again knocked happiness. She did not even believe her feelings at first. She thought just, it seems, afraid. Even the thought of letting it be true. But then it all became too obvious. Kira realized she was expecting a child again after all these years. Andrew seemed pleased, but still took the news a little too reservedly. There wasn't the excitement in his eyes that he'd had years ago when he'd learned of their wife's pregnancy. Wow, this is unexpected, he smiled. Then he pulled Kira to him and kissed her. We need to find you the best doctors. We're getting older. You understand? Kira understood. And of course she was worried too. Pregnancy when you're in your 20s is very different from a woman in her 40s. There are definitely more risks. Sons took the news of the imminent arrival of a brother or sister positively. Wow, we will have a little one. Max smiled. It's so weird, Vince shook his head. But I like little one. It's fun. They're funny, Maggie smiled at the news. Well, it's unexpected, of course. But it's nothing special. I had Andrew when I was a little younger than you. Everything's going to be fine now. Despite Kira's fears, the pregnancy went easily. However, as an older woman, she had to undergo more frequent examinations. At the next ultrasound, Kira lay on the cold couch and prayed to herself that everything would be all right with the baby. She, of course, dreamed of having a daughter, and for a very long time since childhood. After the birth of her two sons, the wish had somehow been forgotten, and there was no time for that. And now, having found out that she was pregnant again, Kira began to hope again. How she wanted to become a mom of a charming girl. The woman chased these thoughts away from herself, convinced that one should be happy about any child, and it is unlikely that after two boys suddenly such a miracle will happen. Why would it suddenly be a girl? Now, lying on the couch, Kira wanted only one thing, that this child that lives under her heart. Everything turned out to be all right. And boy or girl a matter of tenth. After all, how many of their cases are terrible? Being pregnant with her first sons, Kira did not know a lot of things. Now she had a lot of information that made her heart clench anxiously and her eyes stare into the face of the doctor, who was running a sensor across her abdomen to read her emotions. Kira kept thinking the doctor was frowning. How scared she was. Was it really that bad in there? "Do you have a girl?" suddenly said the man in a white coat in a calm and mundane tone. A hot wave of joy flooded Kira's heart, even a little dizzy. She didn't expect to be told the sex so early, and now it was a girl. Was this really happening to her? Had her dream come true after all? After all these years? Is she all right? Kira asked the question she wanted to know. "Everything is fine, there are no abnormalities," reassured the doctor. Kira was born on time. Kira had long ago thought of a name for her future daughter. It seems, still in the university, Emily. Kira, Emily, sounds similar, and that's great. The girl was born a healthy baby and soon became the family's favorite. Maggie now came to Kira's house every day to babysit her granddaughter. Once again, her help came in handy. Kira adored her daughter because she had waited so long for her. She had already stopped dreaming of such a gift of fate, but sometimes she needed time to go to the bath or to go shopping alone. And that's where Maggie came in. Time flew by at breakneck speed. Kira already knew that this is what happens when you have a small child. He's just a helpless little baby. Before you know it, it's already a person with its own character and hobbies. Emily turned out to be a pretty little girl. She took after Kira. She was just as dark-skinned, slender, and graceful. But her eyes were her father's bright blue, huge like two lakes. They shone on her beautiful, swarthy face. The boys grew up. Max graduated first. He easily got into the Boston Medical Academy. Max must have decided in the 5th grade that he was going to be a doctor. At first, his parents thought it was a frivolous hobby. But as time went on, the eldest son stayed true to his dream. In the end, he entered the medical school, and on a budget. Kira at first was afraid to let the young guy alone in the big city. But Max was serious and independent enough for such an enterprise. So in the end, the mother had to respectfully accept his decision. A few years later, Vince followed his brother. He also entered Boston University, but he chose a different specialty. From childhood, he was attracted to computers, programs, technical puzzles. His sons had flown the nest, and his husband was living a life of work. During this period, Kira realized what a happiness it is that she has a daughter small, beautiful, loved and loving. She filled women's lives with joy and happiness, made it bright and meaningful. If it were not for Emily, Kira would feel now all alone and not needed by anyone. Emily practiced ballet. Emily was a ballerina, and the girl was great at it. Choreographers all said the little girl has a real talent. Kira knew that her daughter went in her. Except that in childhood, Kira did not have such an opportunity to show her gift. Her father certainly didn't take his daughter to potential toys. Emily, on the other hand, did. The girl even traveled with performances in different cities. A real tour, and loving, caring mother everywhere accompanied her. It was a bright and rich life, which gave Kira a daughter. Everything was good, just wonderful. The boys studied and worked in Boston. Kira sometimes visited them. The sons were happy, and that was gratifying. Andrew was developing his business, which was becoming more and more profitable. Now, Kira also had a daughter. A long-standing dream had come true after all. It would seem, live and be happy. But the heart of the woman more and more often clenched from some vague premonitions. Something was wrong. Something was not right. Kira chased bad thoughts away from herself. Even to the psychologist was going to turn. But one day the reason for the vague anxiety revealed itself. Kira then went to the shopping center to find a dress for the next performance of her daughter. She wasn't feeling well, must have caught a cold somewhere. So Maggie stayed with her. Kira went to the mall alone. The woman was in high spirits. She had found a wonderful outfit for her daughter, and it was just the right size. She imagined how delighted her girl's eyes would shine when she took out this airy, shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow miracle from the branded bag. That's when the woman noticed Andrew. She just happened to glance down, going up the escalator, and saw downstairs, on the first floor, her husband in a bright orange shirt, which she herself gave him. It was a stylish shirt with short sleeves, summer, dressy and elegant, at the same time. Andrew liked it immediately, and now he often wore it to work. Andrew was not walking alone, he was hugging a young girl. From afar, Emily could not see the details, could not see the stranger's face, did not have time to estimate her age, but she noticed the main thing. Andrew's hand was resting on the lady's slender waist. She, in turn, had her palm in the back pocket of Andrew's pants, and Andrew was smiling happily. The world turned upside down in just a few moments. Kira was walking up the escalator steps as a happy, accomplished woman who thought she had succeeded in building a strong family. And she arrived on the next floor as a cheated and betrayed spouse to gather her thoughts. Kira went up to the food court, settled at a small table in the far corner of the hall and ordered herself a coffee. What she'd just witnessed. How to explain it? Kira really wanted to find some sort of justification for what she'd seen. She couldn't. If she wanted to, she could still convince herself that Andrew was just walking through the mall with a female employee. Maybe they wanted to look at a competitor's assortment or something, but certainly not like that. Andrew had his arm around the stranger's waist. Both of them were not embarrassed at all by people, who at this time in the mall were plenty. They walked with their arms around each other and smiled as if they were carefree free students. And between them, there was clearly a special relationship between them. It was immediately apparent. Is Andrew cheating on her? It's hard to believe, almost impossible. But why impossible? Kira began to reflect on her life and realized that she and Andrew had long lived as close relatives, but not as loving spouses. All their conversations revolved around the children and their future. When was the last time they went out together? Besides, Andrew was too often missing at work, flying on business trips. Maybe it wasn't business trips at all, but traveling with young mistresses. Kira found it hard to breathe, as if she'd been hit in the solar plexus. She was short of air. Everything was spinning in front of her eyes. Was her happy family life just an illusion? And how stupid did she have to be not to see it? Kira decided not to get emotional. She pulled herself together and got up from the table. She should go home and act like nothing had happened. When Andrew returned, she would discreetly take his phone and look into his correspondence. Then it'll all make sense, and then we can do something about it. We need proof. Otherwise, it's a lot to make up. Maybe it's not that bad. That night, Kira put her plan into action. She'd always trusted her husband. It had never occurred to her to go through his phone before, and Andrew knew it because his cell phone wasn't even password protected. The man had quietly left his phone on the coffee table when he went to the bathroom. He generally assumed his spouse was already asleep, but Kira wasn't asleep. As soon as the sound of water came from the bathroom, She slipped out of bed and went downstairs, grabbed her husband's cell phone, logged into his messages. And there was a lot of interesting stuff there. Kira learned that her husband's lover's name was Kate. She was only 25 years old, not much older than Max. The deceived spouse even saw numerous photos of young beauty Kate. Mostly on them, the girl showed all the advantages of her undoubtedly luxurious figure. Young, incredibly beautiful, bold Kate was not shy in expressions and wrote such things, about which modest Kira was even embarrassed to think. But Andrew clearly liked it. Apparently, the couple had already had quite a long affair. Andrew was firmly hooked by the young beauty. They called each other cute nicknames, made plans for a summer vacation. Apparently, lovers have not the first time they went together to vacation by the sea. It hurt to read this correspondence, but she needed to know what was going on. What she saw shocked her. She didn't want to believe it was true. The correspondence was also about Kira. Kate had called her lover's spouse an old woman, an old joke. Even Andrew did not try to defend his wife. On the contrary, he sent smiling smileys in response, saying that he was amused. How? How could this happen to them? They were once the closest and dearest people to each other, two halves of one whole. They had overcome so much together, and suddenly this. The sound of the water in the bathroom faded. Kira hurriedly put her phone back where it belonged and rushed into the kitchen. Let Andrew think she was just getting a drink of water. For now, she didn't want to show her husband that she was aware of this ugly affair on the side. She didn't want to, or she just couldn't. She needed to digest the news, figure out how to proceed. Realize, after all, what she really wants, and get used to the idea that Andrew an unreliable wall, behind which so cozy to hide from the hardships of life and the usual traitor. Outwardly in the life of the family, nothing has changed. But now Kira became more attentive. Andrew's delays at work and his constant business trips were perceived quite differently. From time to time, while Andrew was in the bathroom or out without his phone at the neighbor's, Kira would look through his phone. Kate texted Andrew frequently. Some of the messages were quite explicit. They were usually accompanied by pictures of the girl. To Kate's credit, she looked great. Judging by the state of her body, the girl spent long hours in the gym. From the correspondence, Kira realized that Kate does not work and does not study. Typical Andrew content that he was apparently willing to pay for it all. No, Kira knew that men just over 40 often pay attention to young nymphs. Probably they feel younger, more energetic, stronger with them than with women of the same age. And what is there to hide? 25-year-old girlfriends, in most cases much more attractive than 40-year-olds. Spouse and reaper. But the woman thought her family wouldn't be affected. She remembered the way Andrew had looked at her, what he had said to her. He genuinely loved Kira. Once upon a time, she hadn't doubted that in the slightest. Could such feelings also grow cold with time? Kate. She was no longer just a lover or a girl for occasional entertainment, which at any moment can be abandoned, changed for another. The relationship between Andrew and his young lady was about 5 years old. Sometimes in their correspondence glimpsed historical dates, and the oldest of them came about the time when Susan was born. Apparently, that was when they had met. Kira remembered that period of time after giving birth, and with a newborn baby in her arms. She didn't feel very well. She probably looked even worse. Kira was completely focused on her health. Her daughter, even her sons, had no energy at that time. Thankfully, by the time her sister was born, they had long since managed to become fully independent young men. Of course, Kira paid almost no attention to her husband, because as it seemed to her, it was not necessary. A grown man, passionate about his work. But maybe that was where the mistake lay. Maybe she herself was to blame for what was happening to their family now. Kira shook her head and chased the wrong thoughts away. What was her fault? It was Andrew, after all, who had decided to look for fun on the side. No would support his wife in a difficult period, to take on some of the responsibilities, to take care of his wife and newly born daughter. No, Andrew chose a different option. Maybe this lovely Kate isn't his first mistress. Andrew had been estranged for a long time. Kira was now clearly aware of that. It's just that the woman preferred not to notice such trifles as distant alarm bells. He earns, does everything for the family, does not drink, does not beat, does not humiliate, and money does not limit. Well, that's great. What else is there to complain about? So Kira didn't complain. She lived and enjoyed a happy, as it seemed to her, family life. And then suddenly it hit her. Maybe Kate was not Andrew's first mistress, but in the fact that it was with her, he had a fairly serious relationship, Kira did not doubt. Andrew was truly in love with the girl. It could be felt in the tone of his messages. What only affectionate words he did not call his mistress. The man protected his lady from household, financial, and any other problems, gave gifts, constantly interested in her desires. It hurt Kira to read this. Perhaps so he did not behave with her even in the most golden years of their marriage. It is understandable then they were spinning, surviving, pulling children, not to sentimentality was. From the correspondence, Kira realized that Kate was pressuring Andrew about the divorce. "When will you divorce your old lady?" the girl questioned, supplying the message with anger-red emojis. "All in good time," baby Andrew replied. "I'm in the process. A lot of things need to be prepared so that we can live not only happily but richly. My princess loves a beautiful life." After all that sweet tone, Andrew's usually reserved and serious tone almost made Kira feel nauseous. But she continued to read the messages, searching them for information about the impending divorce. This moment interested her more than others, because it directly affected both her and the children. Kira was not particularly worried about how her sons would take the divorce. They were already adults, and both of them had been living on their own for a long time. For them, most likely, little will change. But the daughter, she is used to this house and adores her father. Despite his indifference, the little girl will be very worried. Kira had no doubt about that. And something would have to be done about it. In Andrew's messages sometimes slipped that he did not rush into divorce to properly prepare for the care. What would that mean? The spouse was clearly up to something, and Kira wanted to find out what it was about. As far as her relationship with her spouse was concerned, nothing much had changed since Kira had found out about Kate. Faking ignorance was easy. Kira and Andrew had hardly spoken to each other for a long time. Hey, how's it going? How are the kids? That's all they talked about. And that's the life they've had for a long time. Why didn't Kira realize this before? Perhaps she was too busy with her daughter and immersed in her own worries and plans. Kira, of course, didn't tell Maggie about her son's life. She still came over occasionally to play with her granddaughter. There were times when Kira took Susan to her grandmother's house to run errands. But the relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law never became warm and frank. Over the years, Kira had trusted Maggie completely in everything concerning the baby. Perhaps it was the only person with whom the woman could leave her daughter with a light heart. But otherwise, over the years, Maggie and Kira had remained, in general, strangers to each other. No, of course, Kira couldn't tell Maggie about Andrew, though she wanted to share it with someone. Why worry the older woman? Of course she'd be upset to hear about her son's behavior. Will be worried it will negatively affect her health. Of course, the mother-in-law will still find out about the divorce, which of course will have to go to. Even if Andrew had not planned this procedure, Kira herself would have organized it. Because how to live with a traitor? That's how she now perceived her spouse. Well, you fell in love with someone else, say it directly. Why lie, lurk, make cunning plans, thought Kira. Andrew had not even once pulled Kate back when she insulted Kira in her messages. She called her old lady and fat and stupid selkie. Andrew at best ignored these unflattering remarks, at worst replied with approving emoticons. It was offensive. But Kira was much more interested in the vague promises of the spouse to divorce as soon as everything will be solved financially. The spouse was preparing something, some kind of scam, according to the results of which Kira was to be left with nothing. The man did not write about it directly. It is understandable correspondence with the mistress had a completely different character, was light, humorous, in some places passionate. But by some words and hints Kira understood that Andrew was up to something. But how would she know what surprise to expect? Surely the details of the plan Andrew and his mistress discuss when they meet. Kira, understandably, felt hard about the whole situation. The pain of betrayal, the uncertain future, the suspended state. And there was no one to share it with. If her mother were alive, how much easier would this misfortune have been to bear? Kira slept badly, nervous. She turned pale and shriveled. She became irritable, withdrawn. Her physical condition even worsened, with headaches. One morning when Kira was feeding her daughter breakfast, her mother-in-law called. "Are you home now?" Maggie inquired. "Yes," Kira replied, deftly slicing bananas, pouring porridge, serving nuts. "Andrew is already at work and my daughter and I are home." "Great, I'll be right over." Kira cheered. "That's great." So her mother-in-law would babysit Emily. She'll go to the doctor herself in the meantime. Her head was hurting too much. Have them prescribe some pills. I can't take it anymore. Maggie showed up, as usual, with a present for the great, a beautiful doll in a big pink box. The girl threw herself on her grandmother's neck. No, not because of the toy, of course, it was just that there was some special bond between Maggie and Emily. It seemed that grandmother and granddaughter understood each other without words. Something similar Kira had observed before with her sons. Maggie was a wonderful grandmother to all her children, sensitive, caring, attentive. It was surprising, considering her bossy, somewhat cold nature. Surprising, but wonderful. It's so nice to know that your children are so loved by someone other than you. "Good morning," Kira smiled at her mother-in-law. "It's so good to have you here. Emily has missed you already." "I'm actually the one who came to see you today." The smile directed at her granddaughter slid off the older woman's face. She stared at her daughter-in-law absent-mindedly. Kira immediately tensed, sensing that this was going to be about something serious. "Go into the living room and watch cartoons," Kira turned to her daughter. "Okay." Here was a rather dire situation for Kira. It seems that Maggie's mother-in-law guesses or knows about Andrew's infidelity. Maggie is clearly concerned about this and wants to talk to Kira straight, perhaps to caution her or give her advice based on her life experience. This is certainly a painful conversation for Kira to have. She's already suffering from her husband's betrayal, and now her mother-in-law is broaching the subject. On the one hand, Maggie's support can be very valuable in such a situation. But on the other, Kira, perhaps, will be even harder to realize that what happened has become the property of relatives. Overall, the conversation promises to be very emotional and challenging for both women. It is important for Maggie to approach this sensitive topic with sensitivity and understanding, not blaming, but trying to support Kira. And Kira will need to gain strength and patience to listen to her mother-in-law and perhaps make some difficult decisions after their conversation. The situation is far from ideal, but at least Kira has someone close to her who cares. Age was coming to an end as well. Kira didn't see any candidates around her for the role of a father for the future child. That's why she went to the resort that summer, to fulfill her longtime dream. "I lied to Andrew about having an affair at the resort to get pregnant," Maggie said. "He wasn't the only one who thought so, by the way. I announced to everyone that my pregnancy was a conscious move, but it wasn't." Kira was silently catching every word. She'd never heard such candor from Maggie before. "I was about 35 at the time, a young woman by today's standards, with everything ahead of me. Back then, I was considered an old maid. All the time to become a mother and a wife had passed. The train had left." Maggie continued. She wasn't too worried about it. Maggie was fully devoted to her work. She had a responsible position, and she was always busy. The woman liked to realize that she was such an important, indispensable person at the airport. She was respected, listened to, and even feared. Sometimes she wanted to have a child, but sometimes there were regrets that there probably wouldn't be a child. Maggie wasn't too upset, though. She herself had grown up in an orphanage. She had seen so many unhappy fates and wasn't 100% sure she could be a good mother and make her baby happy. That summer she was sent on a trip to the sea from the airport. Maggie could afford to buy the tickets herself, but the union honored her as Employee of the Year. It's nice to be recognized. The resort was wonderful. Comfortable room next to the sea. In 5 minutes walk, a wonderful dining room. And there, in this sanatorium, Maggie met Andrew's future father. It was a so-called business traveler, a young guy about 10 years younger than Maggie herself. He came from some northern town on work. It was Helia's first time at sea, and he looked a little confused at first. It even looked nice. Maggie first noticed him in the dining room. The young man immediately caught her attention. He was good, really good looking, this Helia. Hair the color of ripe wheat, bright blue eyes. Those eyes ended up playing a key role in Maggie's fate. He had amazing eyes. I guess they made me fall in love with him like a girl, Maggie said. I don't think I'd ever seen anything like them before, not even when I was young. Bottomless, bright blue. Attentive. Andrew inherited them. And so did Max and Vince. Wow! Helia has no idea he has a son and grandchildren, and that they have his eyes. Maggie was now looking everywhere with her eyes for a cute guy. At first she didn't understand why she was doing it. But the guy was very young. I bet he'd have a lot of admirers soon. Young, pretty young things just like him. And so it was. For several days Maggie watched from afar as Helia returned to the sanitarium with one and another beauty. All of them were like a selection, slim, tanned, smiling. Helia himself smiled a lot. He had a wonderful smile. From it on his cheeks appeared charming dimples. One day the young handsome man himself approached Maggie. Helia confessed to me that he has been watching me for a long time. He's incredibly attracted to me, she said. It was unexpected to hear that. A young, handsome guy, whom I had been admiring from afar for about a week, but was giving me compliments that made my head spin. I was desperately jealous of all those young beauties with whom he appeared in the sanatorium. And he, it turns out, at the same time dreamed of me and did not dare to approach, afraid of rejection. He said I looked beautiful and inaccessible. Maggie and Helia began a stormy resort romance. They took many walks in the neighborhood, swam at night in the sea, laughed. Maggie felt 10 or 15 years younger around him. I don't think I've ever laughed so much even in my youth, she recalled. It was a wonderful week. I fell in love, I just lost my head, which I don't usually do, Maggie said. It was so unlike me. It was like Helia cast a spell over me. And I didn't see a lot of things. A lot of obvious things. Maggie always paid for her date at cafes, in the dining room, on excursions. He never gave her anything, but she didn't expect him to. Being around this guy was a gift in itself. Then one day Maggie woke up in her room, expecting to see Helia next to her. They'd taken a long walk along the promenade at night, gazing at the stars, talking about everything, and had fallen asleep with their arms around each other in the morning. Maggie felt so happy and peaceful in the arms of her lover. But when she woke up, she didn't see Helia there. I reached up and rolled over onto my other side, Maggie recalled. I still wasn't worried about anything. It had happened before. Helia had probably just gone out for coffee and pastries to surprise me. How nice it is to have someone care for you like that. Maggie dozed for another half hour, enjoying the peace and quiet. But the longer she was alone, the more she realized that something was wrong. Finally, unable to bear the anxiety any longer, the woman stood up. That's when it all became clear. There were no belongings of Galia, no clothes, no favorite wristwatch. He had even remembered to bring a little thing like perfume and a toothbrush. So Helia left while Maggie was asleep. He left quietly, so he wouldn't wake the woman and have to explain himself to her. How's that? Why? Everything was fine last night, Maggie wondered. A wave of sadness, despair, and resentment washed over me. I couldn't breathe. I wandered around the room like a stranger and couldn't find a place to go. My heart clenched with unbearable pain. I thought I had found my soulmate. Helia was so easy, so pleasant, and even though he was much younger, I felt supported by him. Nothing could have predicted this outcome. Even last night, Helia had hugged me tightly, showering me with kisses and compliments. I was seriously planning our future together, Maggie said. Helia lived in a small town up north. He even asked me to go there. And I was ready to give up my career, my apartment, my friends, everything to be near him. In desperation, Maggie opened her closets again and again. Could Helia have just moved his things somewhere else? And himself? Well, he might have been late for some reason, but Helia's clothes were nowhere to be found. But Maggie noticed some of her own things were missing. A box of gold jewelry. She had taken a small portion of her treasures with her on vacation, but they were her favorite 2 pairs of earrings, a dainty chain and a bracelet with small sapphires, original, exquisite pieces. The bracelet was actually brought to me from Germany, Maggie recalled. Now this jewelry box had disappeared. There was no half-empty bottle of Chanel, no. 5 on the bathroom shelf. In the safe closet, I missed 3 dresses I bought when I was on vacation in Riga. You can't find such dresses here. My heart clenched with a bad feeling. Was Gilia really just a criminal? Maggie asked herself. I should probably write a statement to the police. On the other hand, it would be shameful to have to confess to strangers that I lost my head like that, blindly trusting a young traitor. I'm a grown woman, a boss. Maggie sat down on the couch, hugged herself tightly, and began to sway. That's what I used to do when I was a little girl, she recalled. I grew up in an orphanage. There you can't get comfort and sympathy from adults. So I got into the habit of comforting myself. As an adult, I somehow outgrew this ritual. And now, in a moment of stress, the habit has returned. We should get out of this stuffy room and take a walk on the beach, Maggie decided. The fresh sea breeze would give her strength and bring relief. As she approached the front door, she noticed a note. Helia had left her some kind of message on the mirror. My heart jumped with joy, a faint hope that everything would still be all right. Maggie shared her memories. Maybe he's just preparing some kind of surprise? Maggie thought. And here I was almost going crazy with worry. But there was no miracle. Helia had indeed turned out to be a traitor. Only for some reason it was important for him to explain his behavior to Maggie. I guess by now you have already realized everything he wrote in a note. Are you crying? Angry at me, scolding yourself for being gullible. I don't know why I'm writing all this. Usually I just walk away. But you're really special. I can't do to you what I do to others. I really like you. You're strong and noble. And you're a real beauty. Probably any man would be happy beside you, but not me. I realized a long time ago that my happiness is different from most people's idea of a prosperous life. I like adventure, changing places, meeting new people. I realized long ago that I could never be with just one woman. Family, children, everyday life. It's not for me. That's the way I was born. My mother says I took after my father. I never knew him, by the way. He's also a vagabond, an adventurer. This man probably doesn't even know I exist. It doesn't matter, though. Of course, I haven't told you a word of truth. Well, almost none. The fact that you are very beautiful, intelligent, strong, I really think so. Those words of mine were sincere. As for my biography, I named the wrong city. I lied about my age. My name isn't even Helia. That's my favorite part. Making up a legend, pretending to be someone else. Some people imagine me as a young actor, others as a talented young engineer. It all depends on the inspiration. Sometimes it comes to me, and I compose a story about a tragic fate full of hardship. It's fascinating, interesting, exciting, and women love it. I know how to make them happy. even if it's only for a short time. Those glowing eyes of yours, those admiring glances. I make the gray everyday life of lonely ladies bright, colorful, magical. You have to pay for all these things in life, wrote Gelia. That's why I charge a small fee for happy weeks and days. You'll agree that it's only fair. Our week, it was one of the happiest weeks of your life, wasn't it? I'm moving on. New adventures, new stories await me. And you? No offense. You're really special to me. I usually leave in silence, I don't leave notes. But I wanted to explain myself to you. Maggie stared hurriedly at the sheet of paper. What she was reading was hard to put into her head. Helia, who was not even Helia, turned out to be a professional Alfonso, living off women, flitting through life like a careless butterfly. He plays different roles and enjoys it. Most likely we are talking about a special mental disorder, thought Maggie. But a normal person can't live like that. The strangest thing was that when she read the note, she agreed with Helia. The guy was right. This week really had been the brightest and happiest week of her life. Maggie decided to leave this story in the depths of memory, sometimes to return to it again, to feel those bright, positive emotions that gave her Helia. But it turned out differently. After returning from vacation, Maggie realized that she was expecting a baby. I realized that it was the child of Gelia, a man, perhaps not quite mentally healthy, she recalled. But I decided to keep it because first of all, I was tired of being all alone, and secondly, I guess I still loved Helia. Or rather, the image that young man had created. At the due date, a wonderful, healthy, and strong boy was born. He had Helia's eyes. Maggie had noticed that back at the birth center. The handsome, charming baby inherited other features of his father's appearance. He bore little resemblance to Maggie. The woman prayed that the resemblance to Helia would be limited. Knowing the genes Andrew had inherited, Maggie paid special attention to his upbringing. She developed in him responsibility, honesty, and kindness. And Andrew seemed to grow up to be a wonderful boy. With anxiety, Maggie searched in her son traits of reckless adventurer, as was his father Helia. But she didn't find them. Andrew faithfully prepared his lessons, never skipped classes at school, and then at the university. When the guy grew up, Maggie watched his relations with girls with bated breath. But even here, Andrew did not resemble Helia in any way. Before Kira, he dated a former classmate. They had been a couple for several years in a row, no stormy short-term romances. When her son married Kira, Maggie exhaled. It's okay. Andrew has a beautiful wife, wonderful children, his own business. No, the son is nothing like the character of a wealthy Alphonse father. It's not that bad. But it turned out that she had rejoiced too soon. Maggie shook her head. Now I'm going to have to tell you the bitter and ugly truth about Andrew. I kept quiet while it was none of my business. Went through everything inside of me, but now my grandchildren's welfare is at stake. I can't let them be left with nothing. Kira knew what she was talking about. I know he's cheating on me, she said. Andrew has a young mistress. I've seen them together and even read the sweet couple's correspondence. Maggie's eyebrows rose in surprise. And why didn't you scandalize him? How did you even get over it? I'm just confused, Kira admitted. The opportunity to discuss the situation with someone made her feel better. Yeah, it's Andrew's mom, but I felt like she was totally on my side. I see. Maggie nodded. Anybody would be confused. So you know about this, Kate? Kira nodded, then asked, but how did you know about it? Andrew told me, Maggie said. He said he'd been unhappily married for a long time. That you, as a wife, do not pay attention to him. You've lost yourself in the children and the house, become uninteresting and indifferent. The usual male excuses. It was painful for Maggie to realize that the son, the only child, in whom so much invested, apparently still inherited the genes of his father. Even if not immediately, they had taken over. Kira could barely hold back her tears. But maybe he's right. I've been really busy with the kids in the house. Maybe Andrew really did miss my attention. I wish we'd talked about it in time. He's wrong. Maggie was adamant. There's more to it than that. Sometimes the feeling goes away. It happens and it's normal. But this is different. Andrew's lying to you, hiding. And that's the worst part. He and Kate are going to leave you with nothing. You and the kids. How? Kira gasped. She was used to the idea of Andrew cheating on her. And here was a new shock. It seemed to her that her husband adored children and would do everything to provide them with a happy future. And now this. Although these hints that he's preparing for divorce. They have a plan. Maggie shook her head sadly. When I heard it, I wanted to give up both the plan and my son. But then I decided to keep my emotions to myself. If I don't agree, they'll come up with something else. Now, girl, listen to me carefully. Andrew felt like a happy man. He achieved a lot in life, built a whole mini empire, organized a network of stores of sanitary ware. The man had a right to be proud of himself. His family life up to now, everything suited him: a beautiful wife, wonderful children, well-adjusted life. It was a kind of quest to get funds for the family, buy a new car, change the apartment to a large house. And then these tasks somehow ceased to fascinate and bring joy. It became too easy. Andrew no longer needed money. They were enough for new acquisitions, and for traveling, and for children's education. The man was suddenly bored. And then just at this very moment in his life appeared Kate, young and energetic, who loves adventure and adventure. She worked as a sales clerk in one of his stores. One evening, Andrew stopped by one of his stores to talk to the accountant, but she was no longer there. But behind the counter stood a new saleswoman, incredibly beautiful Kate. She was openly flirting with her boss. Andrew at first resisted the feelings that arose. His mother from childhood brought up in him responsibility, hammered into his head the true values of the family. But when it happened, he realized that all these years he had lived in the captivity of his own attitudes. With Kate, Andrew felt young and energetic again. She loved adventure as much as he did and was capable of risky actions. Existence without this girl now seemed bland and boring to Andrew. So it went on for several years. Feelings did not subside, but only flared up with renewed vigor. Andrew literally went crazy about his young, beautiful mistress. He did not want to part with her for a moment, but every night he had to return to Kira, and the atmosphere of the house, once warm and cozy, was now weighing on him. Andrew felt like he was in prison. His lovers were talking more and more about how he needed to divorce Kira. It was a done deal. True, both of them didn't want half of the property to go to his lawful wife. She didn't work, did she? Kate resented her. She was sitting at home, relaxing, watching soap operas, and you worked. All property should belong to you and only you. That's true, Andrew sighed. But the law is the law. Kira will be given half of the jointly acquired property. But isn't there a loophole? You can hire a good lawyer, Kate insisted. Let him figure something out. And one day there was. It was simple and complicated at the same time. It was suggested by a lawyer who was familiar with such matters. I have already had such cases in practice, he said. You need to sign over all the property to a person you trust, said the man in a stylish suit. And your wife should trust him too. Maybe a close friend or relative. My clients explain this to spouses to preserve assets in case of business problems. Everyone has their own version. After that, you can initiate divorce proceedings. There's no property, nothing to divide. And the trustee, after everything, just rewrites houses, apartments, cars on the already divorced spouse, that is, on you. That's it. Andrew thought for a long time. After this conversation, he had only one candidate for the role of such a proxy: his mother. Kira would easily agree to sign over all the property to her. She trusts her mother-in-law, but how to come to her mother with such a request. After all, you'd have to confess everything to her. Still, there was no other way out, and Andrew decided to have a serious conversation. He realized that his mother would not be delighted with the situation. But she's his mom. She will definitely support her son, help. It was a pity to give Kira half of what he earned, especially since Kate is right the wife did not work, lived a quiet and relaxed life. What right does she have to all this? Maggie listened to her son in silence without interrupting. As always, she looked unperturbed and somewhat detached. The only thing that betrayed her anxiety was her fingers, which were relentlessly running over the long sleeve of her sweater. "Have you made up your mind?" Maggie asked when her son had finished. Yes, he nodded. "Don't you feel sorry for Kira?" "I've fallen out of love with her. She's obviously indifferent to me. So now we have to suffer together for the rest of our lives. And what about the property? She hasn't invested a penny in the house or anything else. So it's all fair. I was the only one who worked. She was the one who provided for me. And she raised your kids," Maggie reminded me. "Thanks to Kira, you could think of nothing else but growing the business. She always took care of the rest. And remember, at first Kira helped you a lot." "Doing those reports at night, making estimates," Maggie said. "And then you had a staff of accountants." "You're exaggerating, Mom, really exaggerating what she did." "All right, what about the kids?" You could see that Maggie was taking great pains to control herself. "What about the children? Are you going to pay child support? Help out like that?" "So you'll help me?" After a brief silence, Maggie nodded her head. Andrew could see from her eyes that his mother didn't approve of what he was doing. Well, he didn't expect anything else. The important thing was that she agreed. Andrew signed over all the property to Maggie. Kira didn't suspect a thing. She immediately believed in the fairy tale that Andrew thus just avoided unnecessary risks. Kira had not been paying much attention to anything lately. All her time and attention was devoted to her young daughter. Well, all the better. Kate was as happy as a child. She should be, because everything was going so smoothly, without problems. It seemed to open up a happy, carefree future ahead. Kate and Andrew planned to celebrate their success with a trip to the sea. They had already chosen a resort, even argued a little about it. One day, when all the property was already rewritten to Maggie, Andrew dared to have a frank conversation with Kira. The man, of course, was worried. All the same, to tell the person with whom he lived for so many years, such news is not very pleasant. But Kira took everything surprisingly calmly. Naive woman, apparently, has not yet guessed that she will not get anything in the divorce. She would only find out in the courtroom. And even if she finds out sooner, there's nothing she can do about it. Andrew officially moved into the apartment he'd rented for Kate. Now it was just the two of them, waiting for the court hearing, after which Kira would have to leave home. Where? Her own apartment, the same one they'd lived in before Andrew's success. The ex-wife and her daughter won't be on the street. And the boys, they're already in another city. Young men on their own. You don't have to worry about them at all, Andrew said. And so, finally, the day had come. Andrew and Kate had waited so long for this date. Today, at last, everything will be over. Andrew will get his freedom. A little later, he will transfer everything from his mother to himself. And the sweet couple will fly to the beach with white soft sand. Kate decided to go to the meeting. Together with her lover, she put on an elegant marriage suit, emphasizing the advantages of her gorgeous figure, made light makeup, let her hair down. Andrew once again admired his beautiful beloved. Yes, she looked like a supermodel from the cover of a magazine. In his youth, Andrew had never dreamed of such girls. And here he was, a stunning beauty was in love with him. Being in the conference room, Andrew immediately noticed Kira. She looked surprisingly calm and dignified. For some reason, Maggie was sitting next to her. She was wearing a suit that she had worn as an airport employee on particularly important days, days when she needed luck. His mother's presence confused Andrew. He was worried, why was she here? She's sitting next to Kira. She's here to support her sister-in-law. Odd, given their plan. Kate tensed at the sight of her future mother-in-law, too. She'd taken a dislike to Maggie beforehand. Realized the older woman wasn't thrilled that a young rival had broken up her son's tight-knit family. So what? What did her opinion matter? Absolutely nothing. Maggie greeted her son and his companion with a nod of her head. Kira, on the other hand, said hello loud and friendly, even smiled. The hearing began. The judge read the divorce decree, determined the place of residence of the minor daughter with her mother, and announced the amount of alimony, which should now be paid monthly on Emily Andrew. And then it came to the most important thing of all: property. Since you do not have any common property, you have nothing to divide, the judge concluded the speech. Yes, the marital apartment will remain for her. But that's not all, Maggie reminded her. It's all about the divorce case, the judge looked at her reproachfully. As for your gift, it's not a subject for discussion in court. What gift? Andrew jumped up, his heart clenched with misgivings. Kate, sitting next to him, smiled happily. She did not suspect anything yet. The deed of gift I made to Kira, Maggie replied, looking pointedly at her son. To Kira and the grandchildren. What did you think? I'm going to leave them on the street with nothing, so that you can live happily ever after, and they'll all live in a cramped apartment. Andrew's eyes went blurry. He hadn't expected this from his mother. He looked at Kate. The girl's beautiful face was twisted in an angry grimace. She opened and closed her mouth in surprise, trying to say something, but not a single word escaped her tongue. She even seemed to be out of breath. Kira looked calm and peaceful. The judge was reading out some more formalities regarding the divorce. Maggie was whispering about something with her sister-in-law, and it was slowly dawning on Andrew that it was over. Of course, Kate would leave him now. She wouldn't stay with him through the hard times. That was absolutely certain. He'd have to start all over again. All over again.